A beautiful noblewoman with deep violet eyes and long black hair like a silk veil was sitting on the ground, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and her lips could barely utter words of pleading for salvation to the man beside her, and her name was Rudis Amaryllis. The young woman's fragile figure trembled visibly as she knelt like a broken flower before the majestic throne on which sat the very ruler of this great power, and around him, like silent statues, stood the haughty aristocrats. The emperor looked sadly at the young girl. His name was Bartold Amaryllis, and he was a man whose stern appearance was emphasized by a thick beard. His eyes showed the unbreakable will of a ruler, and on his broad shoulders rested heavily a fur cloak, a symbol of his power. Suddenly, the ruler, shaking the walls of the hall, exclaimed in a thunderous voice, pointing with a heavy finger at the marble floor in front of the special guests, declaring that the long-awaited peace would come to the empire only when one of the nobles was sacrificed. Rudis burst into even more bitter tears as she realized that her own father was willing, without a doubt, to discard her as an unnecessary pawn in a political game and let her die for the sake of a fleeting peace that might never come. Their country was besieged by a merciless attack. Monstrous monsters filled the lands, and ordinary citizens died by the thousands. Their moans and screams filled the streets, and the only hope was the help of the ancient gods. But to call upon them, a sacrifice was required. Rudis admitted with a trembling voice that he had always known about this terrible ritual, but he desperately wanted to live. His heart was tight with horror, and beside the ruler stood a luxuriously dressed lady, whose gaze, full of superiority and cold contempt, was like a sharp blade. The young beauty stood frozen in place, her breathing ragged, her skin cold and beads of sticky sweat running down her face as she realized that fate had fallen upon her, that she had been called to die in the name of the greater good, sacrificing her life to save ordinary citizens. Her own father suddenly roared loudly, his voice echoing through the vaults of the hall like thunder, bringing upon his daughter the cruel truth that the victim had to be someone from the royal family, and everyone in that room had known it all along, except perhaps Rudis herself. Since childhood, the man was cruel to her. He knew neither pity nor affection, and for any offense, even the smallest, he punished her severely, not thinking about the pain he caused her, because in his eyes she always remained unworthy, not what he wanted. When she looked up in fear, it turned out that beside the emperor, full of grace and confidence, was her own sister Selena, dazzling in her grandeur, with a proud posture, golden hair shining like sunlight, and a daring smile. When the night priest ventured to speak, boldly objecting that Selena, with her impeccable royal blood, was a more suitable candidate for sacrifice, Bartold would not even let him finish, interrupting him rudely and angrily, his voice booming like thunder. The ruler made no excuses, made no pretense of hypocrisy. His face glistened with sweat, but his gaze remained heavy and gloomy as he unhesitatingly spoke the cruel truth, admitting that Rudis, born of a simple woman, had always been in his eyes a stain on his family, filth. Rudis, sitting on the cold marble floor, her whole body shaking with sobs, her hands clasped in front of her in despair and supplication, suddenly froze, as if a bolt of lightning had struck her, her tears freezing on her pale cheeks, her mouth opening in a silent scream, and animal horror froze in her eyes. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a thick, sulphurous smoke began to spread rapidly through the hall. Its dark curtains trembled from the crimson sparks that ran around, like red-hot embers, and, sensing a strange presence, the princess turned sharply. Her father, not hiding his usual mockery, coldly remarked that his unwanted daughter must be happy, because at least this time she would prove useful, giving up her insignificant life for the good of the great empire in which she had never managed to occupy a worthy place. The high priest, a firm-faced young man standing beside the ruler, calmly nodded, confirming that this was the will of the gods, and if the sacrifice was performed, the deity would surely hear the prayers, granting the kingdom its long-awaited liberation. Rudis, incessantly, with a broken voice, begged her parents for mercy. Her desperate pleas turned into silent sobs. She bowed again and again, begging them not to hand her over to death, and in that fit of despair she beat her forehead against the stone floor. But Bartold, without even blinking, coldly extended his hand and pointed his finger at his daughter with an indifferent gesture, whereupon the knights, obeying a silent order, immediately seized her hands, squeezing her wrists tightly, not allowing her to free herself despite her desperate resistance. The noblewoman, torn by despair, cried out to her sister in a heart-rending voice, her cry trembling in the air, full of pleading, hope, and horror. She called out to Selena by name, begging her to intercede for her, to protect her, to not allow her to be sent to certain death, but she only watched in silence. Bartold, not hiding a drop of cruelty, pronounced the final sentence loud and clear, ordering that his daughter be immediately handed over to the deity to be torn to pieces, so that her blood would become the price for saving those who were truly dear to him. Rudis, deprived of the strength to fight, felt herself pushed forward abruptly, her body losing its balance, her dress fluttering in the air, her hands shot upwards in a last attempt to cling to life. But her chest was tight with a chilling fear, her lips remained open in a silent scream. Almost mad with terror, she fell to her knees in the damp, cold dungeon, her fingers sliding convulsively along the stone floor until she tore at her skin until it bled, rubbing them with all her might until it bled, begging incessantly for freedom, asking at least for someone to let her out of this confinement. The lady found herself in the center of a ritual circle outlined by glowing red seals, her voice trembling as she begged for mercy, but her pleas were drowned out by the thick magic-saturated air, for the ritual had already begun, and the high priest had begun to invoke the ancient deity. Rudy screamed as a sudden, stabbing pain pierced his mind like a sword. His fingers dug into his hair, his head burned with an unbearable heat, and all around him on the rune-carved stones, trembling and vibrating, shone a magical glow. When the noblewoman, having lost all sense of time, slowly opened her eyes, she realized that she was in absolute darkness, in a void with no walls, no sky, no sounds, only eternal darkness stretched around, and nowhere, near or far, was a single living soul to be seen. She stood frozen in place, standing in tense silence, her hand, trembling, stretched forward, as if trying to sense something in the darkness, but at that very moment her body froze with primal terror, when suddenly behind her she clearly heard a heavy, cold breath. Rudis immediately ran out, without looking back, through the impenetrable darkness, his heart pounding and his breathing labored. But suddenly he heard a faint metallic sound. A silver hairpin decorated with an elegant butterfly suddenly slipped from his hair. Clutching the jewel in desperation, she overcame her fear and put all her remaining strength into one swift strike, without hesitation plunging the graceful pin into the dark monster looming over her, hoping the silver tip would pierce its flesh and grant her salvation. Scarlet blood flowed in hot streams down her wrist, leaving burning marks on her skin, but her fingers clenched convulsively at the metal, as if it were the last thread connecting her to life, and in that desperate grip there was not only pain, but also boundless determination. When de Rudis, barely breathing, opened her eyes, a chilling horror seized her, because a few steps away, monstrously close, two enormous, motionless eyes of a monster were gleaming, staring fixedly at her, and its bottomless body, as if woven from the very darkness, was trembling. The noblewoman recoiled with a heart-rending scream, but fear took hold of her body, not allowing her to even move, and she, with her eyes wide open, stood frozen in a terrifying stupor, unable to look away from the disturbing silhouette that seemed to absorb the light. Suddenly, Rudis felt the strength leaving her body, and at that moment, a painful image appeared before her eyes. She remembered how she once begged her father to help her, but he only coldly walked away, leaving her alone with despair, and all she wanted was to live. Consciousness slowly receded from the aristocrat, like morning mist dispersed by a gust of wind. But before the darkness finally swallowed her, she suddenly seemed to see someone standing next to her, a man with golden eyes, whose gaze penetrated into the depths of her soul. And indeed, when Rudis finally lost consciousness, someone's strong hands with incredible care caught his fragile body, not allowing him to fall onto the cold stone, and it was a young man with blue-black hair and a wild and dangerous look. It all seemed like a nightmare. where the past and the present intertwined in a terrifying reality, because now, even though she was unconscious, she saw her father's figure in front of her again and realized that she was kneeling before him, as helpless as she had been a long time ago. Bartold, however, was filled with rage. His scowl was contemptuous and his haughty voice was cold and distant as he spoke unflinchingly about the need for sacrifice, as if his fate was already sealed and feelings had no meaning. As the dark tendrils of magic began to twist, entangling her fragile body and dragging her into the abyss, the lady screamed, begging with all her might to her father for help and mercy. But his eyes did not reflect a drop of compassion, only a cold gleam, remembering the sentence. With stern cruelty, he reminded her that she was only a child, born to a mere worthless commoner with dirty blood in his veins, and that her existence had been a mistake from the beginning, unworthy of both love and mercy. The noblewoman was frozen in surprise when Bartold, without even softening, reproached her with bitter contempt for the fact that such a miserable creature as she would never be able to find happiness, because her destiny was predetermined from birth and she had nothing left but pain. In fact, for 20 long years, Rudy's had been living in a never-ending nightmare because she had been born with a disability that made her an outcast, forcing her to fight every day for existence in a world where there was no place for her. Her leg was crippled from birth, every step was difficult, and, unable to bear the ridicule and contemptuous glances, she quickly withdrew into herself, remaining only a dull shadow against the background of her brilliant sister, whose golden hair shone in the sun. She did not demand much from her father, she did not expect wealth or fame, but only quietly dreamed that he would, at least for a moment, give her a piece of his love. But he only sat on his majestic throne, looking at her as something insignificant, unworthy of his attention and care. But in the end, Bartold didn't even try to pretend that he cared about her, but instead, without hesitation, signed his daughter's death warrant as she, trembling with despair, knelt before him, begging not for power, nor for forgiveness, but simply for the right to live. Her shoulders shook with heavy sobs, and her cheeks, burning with tears, burned painfully because her whole soul was torn apart by an unbearable injustice, and the only question that tormented her heart was simple and bitter. Why did her father never love her as she loved him? And suddenly, through the veil of pain and resentment, a distant memory emerged before her inner gaze. Early spring, she, barefoot and happy, runs out of her dark room, feeling free for the first time in a long time, and the warm sun gently touches her skin. If fate had given her a second chance, she would no longer cling to a family that despised her. She would no longer look for love where it never existed, but she would simply run away, leaving the past behind and live a free life where she would not have to beg for someone's favor. But suddenly, Rudy's opened her eyes sharply and, breathing heavily, realized that she was lying on a soft bed, her head resting on a pillow, and the warm light of the lamp softly illuminated the room. And this stunned her, because at the last moment before she lost consciousness, she was sure that she was dying. She remembered how her body was torn apart by unbearable pain, her stomach cramping, and every breath so labored that it seemed like just a little bit more, and her lungs would simply refuse to function, and then she would disappear, dissolve into the darkness, just as those who sentenced her to death had wanted. She also clearly remembered that terrible moment when, completely exhausted, she was abruptly pushed into the center of the ritual circle, thrown out as if she were something unnecessary, without saying a word, because for them she was just a victim, an instrument. The aristocrat jumped up, grabbed her head convulsively, and felt sick from the sudden avalanche of memories. Her heart was beating wildly, and horror once again gripped her throat, and she clutched her temples as she tried to regain consciousness. But before her eyes were still the images of the nightmare she had experienced. It turned out that she was not alone in the room. There were many maids moving back and forth, and among them stood out a noble lady whose face expressed nothing but expectation. And as soon as Rudy's showed signs of life, a whisper ran through the room. The princess had finally woken up. The bedroom she found herself in was magnificent. The gilded furniture gleamed in the morning sun, the curtains adorned the walls, and the air was filled with a light scent of flowers. But the most surprising thing was that all the servants, as if they had received an order, hastily bowed to her. Confused, she looked at the girls who sat on their knees in a deep bow, their heads respectfully lowered, and despite the change of scenery, she managed to discern familiar faces in their features, but the dryness in her throat did not allow her to utter a single word. With incomprehension and growing anxiety, Rudis realized that all these ladies had once been close friends of his sister, and now, despite their submission, they could hardly hide their hostility because they hated her with all their souls, who had remained for them only trash for so many years. One of the noblewomen lowered her gaze and asked with feigned respect how the princess was feeling, then added in a calm voice that the emperor himself would soon come to see her, and these words burned into Rudis's mind, for he could not understand what had caused such a sudden change. The girl's name was Lady Ivana, and she had once mockingly called the princess a pitiful wretch, not even to be pitied, and cast mocking glances at her with open contempt, for in all the palace there was no creature whom she and her friends despised more. Being cruel and merciless, they found special pleasure in humiliating the weak girl, deliberately locking her in a dark cupboard, forcing her to sit there in fear for long hours, and then laughingly handing her dry, moldy bread through a crack, claiming that even that food was too much for her. Rudis looked anxiously from one girl to the other, remembering their cruelty, feeling fear paralyze his body, not allowing him to breathe, because he couldn't believe that those evil friends of his sister had suddenly changed, and if they were plotting something again, then what was really hiding behind their feigned humility? Feeling a cold unease spreading within her, the princess, overcome with panic, screamed so loudly that her own voice echoed throughout the richly decorated room, and unable to bear their presence any longer, ordered them to leave, wanting to see only the empty space before her. Ivana, overcome by a storm of rage at the words she heard, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and looked at Rudis with a look full of indignation and rage, but as much as she wanted to respond, she could not utter a single word, stuck in her throat. With a slight but forced smile, the noblewoman said she would leave the room, trying to maintain her dignity, and politely, though with a little pretense, apologized for her insolence in the conversation, allowing herself to say too much to her interlocutor. Rudis, hearing these words, was shocked to the core of her soul, for she could not even imagine that this arrogant villainess, whose arrogance was always at its limit, would actually decide to do such a thing and apologize to her, which seemed like an impossible thing to her. So, without a second thought, he looked intently at the aristocrat, dressed in an elegant blue dress, and with a hint of hidden irritation, asked her what she was trying to achieve by pretending to be a friendly interlocutor when that was clearly not the case. Ivana, however, not hiding her mockery, replied with a lazy smile that this was exactly how a princess who grew up among them should behave, strange and alien, envious of her sister named Selena, who was always the focus of everyone's attention and admiration. In fact, Rudis often watched as his father warmly showered his other daughter with his love, care, and tenderness, as if she were the only light in his life, while stubbornly ignoring Rudis herself, as if she did not exist for him at all. Looking down and biting her lip painfully, the lady suddenly realized with terrifying clarity that she no longer wanted to see her family, that there was no longer a drop of affection left in her heart, but only a caustic hatred that ate away at her soul from within. Although the blood of the emperor himself ran through her veins, giving her an indisputable right to the throne, fate, like a mocking puppeteer, decreed otherwise. She was never destined to take a place alongside him, to become part of the brilliant elite, to gain recognition. Ivana could not calm down and, without hiding her caustic mockery, continued to mock the princess, with feigned concern advising her to put aside her sorrows, because then, according to her, everyone would surely take care of her, although there was sarcasm in every word. But something inside Rudis changed, and instead of the girl trembling with humiliation, another entity full of determination appeared at that moment, and straightening up, ordered everyone to leave his room immediately with a firm and authoritative voice that brooked no objections. Ivana stood frozen in astonishment. Her eyes widened in bewilderment, and her lips parted in silent surprise, because this quiet mouse, whom she was accustomed to despising and humiliating, suddenly dared not only to speak to her as an equal, but also to declare something insolent. Compared to the horror and sinister monster that the young noblewoman encountered during the summoning ceremony, all the conversations with the aristocrats who only felt contempt for her seemed to her nothing more than naive, childish jokes, not even worth her attention. That is why Rudy's, not willing to give in to the demands of others, insisted on her own with particular stubbornness, assuring her that she needed to be completely alone to order her thoughts and find at least a drop of peace in this world full of hostility and hatred. But suddenly one of the noble ladies, unable to tolerate such behavior, cried out loudly, declaring that the princess could not under any circumstances allow herself such disrespectful behavior. After which, without thinking, she grabbed her hand, intending to hold her back. However, the beauty, without even thinking, abruptly pulled her hand away, instantly freeing herself from the stranger's grip, and anger, like a raging flame, flared up in her soul, because this was not the first insolence she had to face that day. The girl, looking anxiously at Rudy's, tried to explain to him that if he drove them away without showing mercy, then a cruel punishment would inevitably fall on their heads and they would face painful punishments that they would no longer be able to avoid. A heavy silence hung over the room, filling the air with tension as the girls stood in front of the princess, who sat on the luxurious bed, keeping an impassive expression, but at the same time staring at them, waiting for them to finally speak. The beauty herself stood frozen in a state of mute shock, her thoughts racing chaotically, trying to understand who could dare to punish noble ladies, and most importantly, for what purpose such a harsh order had been given, which seemed cruel and extremely strange to her. The only person who had enough power to make such a decision could only be his father, the majestic emperor, whose word in this palace was an indisputable law, and no one dared to question it. But suddenly, from behind the huge closed doors, a strange voice was heard, which sharply attracted Rudy's attention, because someone was shouting something, clearly forbidding the uninvited guest to enter the young woman's rooms, as if trying to prevent something unwanted. Suddenly the door opened with a loud noise, and a person entered the room resolutely. A tall lady in a scarlet dress, who walked smoothly but confidently towards the aristocrats and the princess herself, not hiding her rage and indignation. It was Selena herself, angry as the devil himself, with her cheeks flushed, a wild, almost insane look, and her hands clenched into fists that trembled with anger, revealing the storm of emotions that was burning inside her and that she could no longer contain. She shouted a question out loud, demanding an explanation, her voice trembling with rage and her mouth remaining slightly open as if she were panting from the indignation that filled her, as she stared at the people in front of her. Pointing her finger at Rudy's, the noblewoman loudly demanded that he explain to her how her unworthy sister dared to come into her chamber, sit on her bed, and why everyone present bowed their heads in humiliation before this worthless loser. Selena, furious and even more outraged because none of the ladies present even attempted to comply with her order and leave the room, decided to take things into her own hands because she was not going to tolerate such a flagrant disgrace. Without wasting a second to think, Selena lunged forward with furious determination, roughly grabbed her sister by the hem of her dress sleeve, and forcefully pulling her towards her, attempted to drag her out of the bed, completely without thinking about the consequences of her actions. With a dark expression on her face, behind which a thick darkness seemed to swirl, Selena ordered her relative to leave the room immediately with a cold and peremptory tone, her fingers tightly clenched on the fabric of the dress, leaving Rudis no chance to resist. However, the girl only stared at the ground, showing no fear or indignation, as if her soul had long since resigned itself to its fate, and any attempt to fight seemed futile, because fear of her sister had long since ceased to rule her heart. Selena stood frozen, shocked to the core when she received no reaction to her threats. No fear, no pleading, not even an irritated look, just a cold, almost lifeless indifference that made her boil inside. She smiled nervously, but her face still reflected confusion, her frown expressed growing irritation, and her voice, low and hard, cracked in a displeased question. Did Rudis really dare to ignore her? Anger, hatred, and unbridled rage distorted the beautiful features of his face. His teeth were clenched in fury, the veins on his temples were swollen, and his eyes burned with royal fury, ready to burst forth at any moment. And at that very moment, suddenly flushed with anger, the noblewoman waved her hand, intending to strike her disobedient relative, wanting to teach him a lesson for his insolence and for daring to contradict her, showing neither fear nor submission. But before her palm could reach its target, Ivana quickly intercepted the princess's hand, tightly squeezing her wrist, preventing her from striking and thus avoiding a reckless act that could not only worsen the situation, but also provoke her father's wrath. Selena stood frozen in utter confusion, her body shaking, her eyes darting around in search of an answer, but she couldn't understand why her best friend had suddenly taken Rudy's side, when previously they had mocked her together without a shred of compassion. The sacrificial ceremony that had taken place only 3 days earlier had apparently not been a success, judging by the gloomy and depressed expression on the high priest's face, as well as the deep thought that had frozen in the eyes of the emperor himself. Selena, saddened and depressed by the fact that her own father suddenly began to avoid and ignore her, desperately tried to talk to Prince Arctis, hoping for support, but he did not even deign to meet with her, instead sending a servant to convey his refusal. But the hardest blow for the girl was another. That same day, when she was walking quietly, enjoying the moment of solitude, she was suddenly interrupted, forced to stop. Irritated by such rude interference in her thoughts, she turned around abruptly. The maid, respectfully bowing her head to the princess, explained in a calm but confident voice that after a complete recovery, the emperor had made a final decision. Sister Selena was to return to the palace and live with them again, as before, without any objection. Selena, suddenly overcome with indignation, exclaimed with genuine fury that this could not be true, that there was clearly some monstrous mistake in what had happened, or, worse still, some absurd and senseless nonsense that she refused to believe. Filled with indignation and incomprehension, she firmly decided that the only way to understand what was happening was to meet her father in person and demand an explanation of why he had suddenly changed his mind and decided to return her sister home. Unable to contain her anger, the lady behaved in a defiant and insolent manner towards her father, uttering harsh, almost angry words, accusing him of obviously not being aware of his own actions and of not realizing what his unexpected decision could lead to. And now Ivana, instead of standing by her side as before and smilingly mocking Rudy's, suddenly changed and began to restrain her from rash actions, which only further inflamed the feeling of betrayal and bitterness in the princess's soul. Selena, unable to contain her emotions, burst into tears in front of everyone, looking at Ivana with eyes full of tears and rage. Her voice trembled with resentment, and a blush of rage flashed on her cheeks as she shouted, "How dare she treat her like that because they were friends?" Rudy's just chuckled, looking at this scene with slight surprise, not understanding why his sister was so shocked by her friend's betrayal, because she herself had long been accustomed to the rudeness and injustice of those around her, perceiving it as something obvious. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, Princess Selena, unable to contain her emotions any longer, fell straight to the ground and screamed her heart out, causing everyone around her to freeze in shock because no one expected such abrupt and childishly capricious behavior on her part. Sobbing and screaming, breathing heavily from anger and resentment, Selena screamed in desperation that she would definitely tell her father everything, and then he would definitely punish them all for their cruelty, injustice, and unacceptable treatment of her, a princess of royal blood. Suddenly the heavy doors swung open with a resounding echo, and the ladies seated in the hall began hurriedly whispering amongst themselves as a servant solemnly announced that the emperor himself had come to see them, whose sudden appearance caused a slight excitement among those present. All the noble ladies, observing court etiquette, bowed elegantly to the ruler as soon as he crossed the threshold, and even the princesses, noticing their father, hastened to pay attention to him, feeling that his presence had something alarming and important. Bartold stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark robe. His face was gloomy and sullen, and from his figure emanated a heavy, almost tangible aura of discontent, in which one could sense the severity of a ruler and the anger of a man who had come here for a specific purpose. Rudy's, unlike the others, did not bow her head to her father, but instead straightened up and, without looking away, looked bravely into his stern eyes, because she had already made a firm decision: never again to allow anyone to treat her as a weak-willed shadow. When Selena began to complain in a broken voice to her father that everyone around her was insulting her, humiliating her, and not respecting her at all, the emperor, instead of comforting his daughter, rudely interrupted her, sharply asking her when she would finally stop behaving like a spoiled child. The lady stood there in confusion, her lips trembling in surprise and a shadow of incomprehension flashing across her eyes as she desperately asked why her father had suddenly become so cold and why he spoke to her in such an indifferent tone, which had never been heard in his voice before. The man did not show the slightest mercy. He did not stop for a moment. He simply walked past her, as if she were an empty space for him, and then he barked, demanding that his daughter shut up immediately, stop irritating him, and not dare to throw tantrums in front of him. Selena, as if stunned by a blow, stood frozen in place, unable to believe what was happening because her father, always kind and patient, had never spoken to her so rudely before, and this sudden change made her eyes burn and a lump of resentment form in her throat. Covering his face with his hand to hide his tiredness and tension, Bartold sighed after a brief pause and, softening his voice, reluctantly apologized for his harshness, explaining in a low voice that now was not the most appropriate time for his hysteria, because his mind was occupied with much more important things. After this, the emperor, without wasting time on unnecessary conversations, with a firm and determined step, walked towards his second daughter, who was sitting silently on the edge of the bed, looking fragile and lost, but still trying not to betray the fear that had taken hold of her. Without a single emotion on his face, with a cold and even voice, he said that apparently Rudis had finally come to his senses. His tone was dispassionate, distant. There was no sense of joy or excitement in it, as if his awakening was just a long-awaited event. The noblewoman herself, feeling her heart tighten painfully within her breast, sat with her eyes downcast, not daring to utter a word, for her lips trembled treacherously, and her voice, if she attempted to speak, would surely break, betraying how much she was afraid. She remembered the cruel words that had once escaped from her father's lips, cold and merciless, like a sharp sword piercing the heart, for he had told her beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was a nonentity, that she existed only by absurd chance, that she had neither meaning nor value. In a stern, authoritative voice that brooked no argument, Bartold ordered his daughter to immediately get out of bed and follow him, in a dry, distant tone, as if he were not speaking to a blood relative, but to a common servant, obliged to obey without unnecessary questions. The girl, however, did not move. She continued to sit where she was and looked straight at her father with the same silent, firm, and, what was especially bold, condemning gaze, in which there was no fear, but only an unwavering determination not to submit to his will any longer. The emperor, accustomed to unconditional obedience, lost his composure for a moment, astonished that his daughter had dared to disobey, and, stepping back in involuntary horror, he suddenly realized that before him was no longer a defenseless girl, but something far more terrifying. The look in the beauty's violet eyes was dark, sinister, and deep, not reflecting a single spark of emotion, but only a bottomless, terrifying darkness that seemed capable of piercing anyone who dared to look into its abyss. That icy cold that emanated from his very being resembled the disturbing breath of an abandoned and cursed temple in the midst of darkness and silence, where the walls hold the whispers of a forgotten past and the air is saturated with an ancient and inexplicable fear. But the man did not let himself be overcome by this strange feeling, quickly repressing the doubt that welled up inside him and firmly convincing himself that in front of him sat only a useless cripple, a mudblood, whose existence was only a pathetic misunderstanding, who was not worth his worries. So Bartold, not allowing himself to be discouraged, repeated his order with renewed fury. But this time he did not limit himself to saying it, but burst into shouts, demanding that his daughter get out of bed immediately and follow him, submitting to his will as befits the weakest. The man remained motionless, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for the princess to show submission, obey his order and get out of bed, But, contrary to his expectations, she continued silent, in no hurry to respond or at least show any intention of fulfilling her father's will. Rudy stood motionless, his face impassive as if carved from marble, but deep in his violet eyes there was a firmness, cold and hard as frozen ice, and only after several agonizingly long seconds did he finally look up. After that, looking up, he asked quietly but firmly why he should do that. Why follow his father if he had neither the desire nor the reason to submit to his will? There was no fear in his voice, only a calm and icy determination. By asking that question, she dared to challenge her father, breaking the established rules according to which his word had to be an indisputable truth for her. But despite this, she did not look away or flinch. After a brief pause, Rudis repeated his question, but now there was even more firmness in his voice, and, clenching his fists, he added that he would not go if her father had decided to sacrifice her again, if for him, her life was once again just a bargaining chip. Filled with rage, Bartold abruptly raised his hand, intending to strike his daughter for her insolence, for her disobedience, for that cold, defiant gaze. But at the last moment he froze as he realized there were other nobles in the room, closely watching his every move. If he let his anger carry him away and raised his hand against the princess in front of witnesses, it would inevitably cast a shadow over his reputation, exposing him not as a just ruler, but as a man unable to control his own emotions. So he slowly lowered his hand. Containing his anger, the man coldly repeated his order, this time putting even more ironclad superiority into his voice, demanding that the princess obey immediately, stop her senseless resistance and follow him, because her patience was coming to an end. Rudy slowly raised her eyes, looking at her father, and suddenly seemed to realize how stupid she had been before, because it had taken her so long to see his true nature, rotten inside, devoid of love. Finally, the princess quietly rose from her bed, trying not to show the trembling in her fingers, and slowly began to put on her slippers, realizing that further resistance would bring her nothing but even greater wrath from the emperor, which meant that it was best not to take any chances and provoke him now. The maid, seeing her mistress staggering, immediately ran to help her, but Rudis, without even looking at her, calmly replied that it was not necessary, as she was completely fine, although that was far from the truth. The long corridor of the palace, covered with expensive carpets with richly decorated walls and gold-carved doors, stretched out before them, reminding them of the grandeur of the empire, but to Rudis's eyes it seemed like just a cold prison with no way out. The emperor, without turning, opened the heavy doors and advanced confidently, his quick, firm steps echoing in the silence, and the princess, barely perceptibly clenching her fists, followed him, feeling her heart clench with anxious foreboding at every step. Rudis, obediently following his father, suddenly froze for a moment, surprised to notice that in the room they were heading to, there was already a person whose presence made his heart beat a little faster, filling his mind with disturbing thoughts about the reason for this sudden visit. A young man sat on one of the chairs, and as soon as Rudis had time to look at him properly, he jumped up, a friendly, even overly cheerful smile appearing on his face, which for some reason seemed out of place to her, as if something was hiding behind it that she could not yet understand. It was none other than the high priest named Bennett, a man whose place in the empire was no less important than that of the emperor himself, and before the princess had time to realize what this strange visit was leading to, he suddenly said that he was glad to see her. The emperor, without showing any emotion, sat down on one of the sofas. Rudis took his place, and in front of them sat the priest, and silence hung in the air, foreshadowing a long and difficult conversation in which, he felt, he was about to hear something that would change his life forever. As soon as the emperor gave the order, the servants, not daring to hesitate, hurriedly left the hall, and behind them the heavy door slammed shut with a dull echo, finally separating the room from the rest of the palace, enclosing within it a tense, almost tangible silence. The last footsteps had barely faded away when Bartold's expression abruptly changed, the ostentatious restraint evaporating, and he demanded an answer from the priest as to whether they really needed Rudis in this ritual, and whether there really was no other way out. The emperor clenched his fists in anger, his voice growing louder and sharper, demanding a clear answer as to whether Bennett was sure that the one who had appeared during the ritual was truly the supreme god, and not just a shadow play born of blind faith and fear. When the priest, after much deliberation, finally gave his blessing, Bartold, overcome with a storm of emotion, leapt from his seat, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief as he declared that this could not be, and then, with despair in his eyes, he pointed to his unloved daughter. After that, he looked away, thought for a moment, and added with cold determination that, among other things, the lady had been left completely unharmed, which only increased his suspicions and made him search for a hidden meaning in what was happening, which no one could yet understand. The priest, looking down and experiencing internal conflict, he admitted that even before, doubts had arisen in his heart, and he was not entirely sure whether the deity that appeared to him was real, because its actions and words did not always match what was predicted in the sacred texts. The man's hand gripped the armrest of the massive throne tightly, betraying the tension within him as the ruler of the great empire frowned in irritation, his thoughts racing between anger and the need to remain calm. The priest, clearly feeling uncomfortable under the emperor's heavy gaze, carefully noted that higher powers do not always obey the commands of those who call upon them, as there is an unbridgeable gulf between a mortal's request and an order to be carried out. The emperor, hearing such insolent words, frowned sharply, and his face became distorted with rage, after which he roared angrily, demanding that the priest be silent immediately, for he no longer wished to hear a word that might sow new doubts in his soul. The lady remained silent, only occasionally casting cautious glances, while her father, on the other hand, sat in his chair with obvious displeasure, tensely drumming his fingers on the armrest, as if he were holding back emotions that threatened to burst forth at any moment. Rudis couldn't help but notice the absurdity and ridiculousness of the situation she found herself in, as if fate had decided to play a cruel joke on her, cornering her in a corner where any decision threatened to turn into suffering for her. When the man, with cold determination, suggested performing the ritual again, assuring her that this was the only possible way, the lady could not contain herself and resolutely opposed it, declaring that she did not want to become a victim again, and without batting an eyelid, called her own father a true tyrant. Gathering all his determination, Rudis firmly stated that he would never, under any circumstances, become a victim again, no matter what anyone tried to order him to do, and that he would rather meet his fate than allow himself to submit to someone else's will again. Enraged by his daughter's refusal, the ruler of the empire leapt from his seat, his voice rising to the ceiling as, uncontaining his anger, he called her ungrateful, and then, narrowing his eyes, coldly declared that if she did not agree voluntarily, she would be punished with a whip. Rudis did not back down and stubbornly continued to insist on his own, declaring that Selena was more suitable for the role of victim because her blood was pure, which meant that the ritual would have a much greater chance of success than if she had been chosen, and he could not ignore this fact. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the air in the room as the father quickly raised his hand and slapped his daughter hard across the face, silencing her, his gaze burning with fury and his voice filled with contempt as he ordered her to never say such nonsense again. The emperor's face remained covered in a dark shadow, his lips twisted with malice as he coldly declared that his daughter was a terrible egoist, for whom her own life meant more than the fate of the entire family, and this was the most shameful betrayal. Rudis looked at him with an impassive expression on her face and couldn't understand what she should be grateful for. Was it really for the years of ridicule, constant humiliation, and cruel bullying he had inflicted on her since childhood, making her feel insignificant? The high priest stood to one side, his hands shaking slightly and cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He watched in horror as the emperor repeatedly raised his hand against his daughter, but he could not dare to stop him, because he knew he would pay for it with his own life. Rudis was breathing heavily, his chest was constricted by pain, a drop of scarlet blood ran down his lips, his eyes were clouded with weakness, but what he felt most was not physical pain, but fear and bitterness, as he realized that he would never be someone his father could love. The man did not calm down and, overcome by rage, continued shouting, demanding to know why his daughter dared to go against his will, why she resisted so stubbornly and only complicated what could have been resolved a long time ago if she had simply submitted as she should have. The noblewoman, getting up with difficulty, only indifferently wiped the blood running down her lips and looked at her father with a cold gaze, realizing how stupid she had acted before, wanting to find his love, because only now did she clearly see the monster he had always been. A chill ran through the man's body, although he did not want to admit it, but fear invaded him, because in front of him sat a beaten girl who should have been crying and begging for mercy, but instead remained frighteningly calm, as if everything that was happening did not matter to her. Everything seemed to be going wrong. People were following their own paths, not the ones the master had prepared for them. Even Rudis's foolish mother at one point refused to obey and strayed from the path, which for him became another betrayal. In a fit of rage, the man roughly grabbed his daughter by the hair, forcing her to look him straight in the eyes, but even then she continued to stubbornly resist, steadfastly refusing to accept his plans and follow the cruel plan he considered the only correct one. But suddenly the heavy atmosphere of the room was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and the next moment the door opened, another man appeared on the threshold, whose voice, full of surprise and slight discontent, echoed in the silence as he asked what was causing such a noise here. At the door stood a tall, terrifyingly handsome man with a wild, almost animal look. His golden eyes with narrow pupils glowed like two glowing embers, and his long black hair fell in thick locks over his shoulders. Those present in the room felt a chill run through their bodies, tension thickened in the air, and even the emperor himself, who had never known fear before, stepped back, instantly ceasing to torture his daughter. His face paled and his gaze turned towards the guest. The stranger's yellow eyes flashed, rage lurking in their depths, but he remained sullen and silent, as if holding back the storm that raged within him, his silent presence exerting far more pressure than any threat or angry shout. The nobles, realizing who was before them, quickly bowed their heads in reverence, for before them appeared the deity himself, whose arrival was awaited with trepidation and fear, but none of them could predict what kind of wrath he would bring. Rudis looked up in astonishment as even his domineering and unyielding father, who always held his head high, suddenly bowed his head to the stranger, casting wary glances at him as if trying to understand who this man was, who could inspire fear in the emperor himself. The young man, without giving anyone an extra glance, walked past the priest with a confident but unhurried step, heading straight for the ruler, his yellow eyes flickering in the dim light of the room, exuding a certain dangerous, almost predatory power from which one wanted to take a step back. However, without stopping near the emperor, he silently continued on his way, passed by him and sat down next to the princess, who was sitting on the cold stone floor, wounded, exhausted, with a dull look that had not yet lost its pride. Battered, exhausted, and overwhelmed with fear, the noblewoman slowly raised her head with trembling eyes, studying the stranger from top to bottom, her disheveled hair falling in disarray about her face, and her dirty, blood-stained dress reminding her of her recent suffering. Her violet eyes, wide with astonishment, trembled in the darkness, reflecting a mixture of horror, incomprehension, and a slight hope. She did not know what to expect from this mysterious man, whose gaze shone with a strange golden light. Having made sure that the girl was the princess, the stranger calmly knelt before her. His movements were slow, but contained an undeniable confidence, as if he did not doubt his right to be near her. Rudis opened her lips in confusion, unable to hide her surprise, and the next moment her face flushed slightly. Completely unexpectedly for her, she felt warmth and a strange calm within her, as if the danger tormenting her heart had retreated with this man. When asked who he was, the young man did not give a direct answer, but only with a slight smile asked a counter-question, in which a mocking joke shone through. Did the lady herself, having already come face to face with him, not understand who he really was? Then, after briefly holding her gaze, he noticed her confusion, allowed himself a slight smile, and, as if amused by her confusion, calmly suggested that she call him Levain, as if that name should dispel all her doubts. The noblewoman looked at that mysterious man completely confused, trying to understand the meaning of his words and capture at least something familiar in his face. But no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't understand who he was and why he spoke to her with such confidence. Her wide, bewildered violet eyes reflected the stranger's appearance, her black hair and gaze burning with a yellow fire, but no matter how hard she tried to search through her memory remained stubbornly empty, giving no answers. Levane, closing his eyes, calmly reminded her that their meeting had occurred much earlier than she could remember, for he was the same creature that had languished for many years in captivity deep beneath the earth, in a crypt hidden from mortal eyes. The noblewoman stood frozen in shock, her body not moving and genuine horror splashing across her wide eyes as scarlet blood flowed down her broken skin, a cold touch reminding her of her recent suffering, but the fear that gripped her now was much deeper. The young man turned out to be the same monster she had encountered in the total darkness, when his body had been hidden by the darkness, and the only thing that gave away his presence were two enormous, bright, predatory eyes, which watched her cautiously from the depths of the night. Long before all living things appeared, before the first dawn and the first words of humanity, this ancient deity existed in the darkness, silent, all-consuming, unchanging, as if time itself had no power over it. They were once called gods, worshipped, sacrifices were offered to them, favors were asked of them, but in reality these creatures were demons, ancient and insatiable, whose true desire was the flesh of others, the blood of others, and the subjugation of the weak. The young man lazily waved his hand to the side, as if he wanted to brush something invisible off him, and with a slight mockery asked if the lady did not find everything that had happened to her strange, unbearably alien to her understanding, as if reality itself had begun to distort. And then he added indifferently that if she was unhappy about something, if there was indignation or fear in her heart, then the girl should tell him directly, because silence would not save her from what had already happened. Rudy stood frozen in mute horror. Her body seemed to have turned to stone. Her lips did not move, and the fear gripping her throat did not allow her to utter a sound, and all she could do was stare silently with wide eyes, fearing that any wrong word could be a fatal mistake for her. A scarred male hand tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with unexpected tenderness, gently sliding it down her cheek, as if such a caring gesture could erase the traces of pain and fatigue left by her own father's cruelty. Levane, whose expression remained calm, tried to reassure his interlocutor by telling him gently that everything was fine, that his fears were in vain, and that he would help her up, because seeing her hurt and suffer was unbearable for him. The woman's hands trembled, clenching into fists in bewilderment and internal protest, because she couldn't understand why the creature that was called a monster was suddenly showing such kindness, why this monster was talking to her as if she didn't need to be afraid. As he waited for her decision, the young man leaned forward slightly, holding out his hand with unwavering calm, his amber eyes never leaving her face, and in that gaze was a promise. He would not back down, he would not turn around, he would not leave until she accepted his help. Levane noticed that the lady stubbornly refused to accept his help, and, not wanting to insist, with a slight smile he offered her another way out, promising to deal with her attackers in the way she herself wanted, because now she had the opportunity to change her destiny. Rudis raised his head silently, his gaze flickering when he heard that she was the reason why this mysterious man was here, and the thought that everything that happened was not an accident made his heart skip a beat. Suddenly, Levane, without losing his predatory grace, leaned carefully towards her and gently cupped her cheeks with his palms. His touch was warm, full of something inexplicable, and in that gesture one could read not only support, but also a strange, inexplicable caress. The people in the room stood frozen in complete shock, unable to take their eyes off the princess, who suddenly began to softly glow with a pinkish glow, and the girl herself felt something inexplicable awaken in her body, filling her with a warmth she had never known before. As if responding to his change, pink magic patterns also began to spread across Levane's body, glowing on his skin, and this instant response of ancient power changed the entire atmosphere in the hall, causing those present to hold their breath. Lavaine, with a slight smile, pronounced the magical words of the promise, full of sincerity, and presented the lady with proof of his devotion, which caused her genuine surprise, because she never thought that someone would be capable of linking her destiny with her life. With a soft sadness in his voice, the young man told her that his existence in this world was not an accident. It was inextricably linked only to her, and if it were not for her, he would have remained forgotten, buried in the darkness where his true nature should have remained forever. Hiding a shadow of sadness in his amber eyes, Lavaine lowered his gaze and admitted with calm frankness that if something happened to him or the magical seal that united them disappeared, he too would be erased from the world, returning to the primordial chaos where his existence would lose all meaning. The young man warmly called Rudy's his savior and asked with slight reproach if after all that had been said, he still could not trust him, since now their destinies were intertwined more strongly than even the ancient prophecies could have imagined. Rudy's, with trembling fingers, slowly raised her hand and gently squeezed Lavaine's palm resting on her cheek, that simple gesture showing that she finally accepted his words and was ready to entrust him with her faith, her destiny, and perhaps something more. Lavaine, with a warm smile and unwavering trust in his gaze, gently lifted the princess from the cold ground, allowing her to lean on him, and in that simple but meaningful gesture there was a promise. From now on, as long as he was near, she would no longer be alone and would never fall. The lady, rising from the cold stone floor, suddenly realized with genuine astonishment that the wound which had so recently tormented her flesh with burning pain had healed itself, and she could now stand firmly as though she had never been subjected to any injury or torture. The conversation was interrupted suddenly and without warning. The imperious and impatient voice of the emperor himself, sounding with a hint of barely contained irritation, addressed Monsieur Lavaine, demanding immediate attention and not tolerating a second of delay. When the ruler, with pride and cold dignity, declared that he had achieved all he had set out to do, the young man, through whose veins flowed divine power, was inflamed with righteous anger, and a fiery light kindled in his eyes, casting a terrifying golden glow. An icy chill ran down Bartold's spine, causing him to instinctively step back, as if the darkness enveloping the figure in front of him had taken on a will of its own and was about to swallow him up, leaving him unable to even breathe in the oppressive, heavy air. Realizing the hopelessness of his situation, the ruler of the great empire, clenching his fists and breathing deeply, bowed respectfully, almost submissively, before the powerful lord named Lavaine, humbly asking to fulfill all that was required of him. When the young man agreed to fulfill the request, Bartold was at first relieved, his heart trembled with joy, but this brief moment of happiness vanished the moment he heard that behind all this there was a single but extremely heavy condition. Lavaine, keeping a cold expression on his face that did not reflect even a shadow of emotion, said without a doubt that he was demanding the most important thing from the emperor, to give up all his powers and unconditionally transfer power over the empire to him. Bartold stood frozen, as if a bolt from the blue had struck his consciousness, and frowning in confusion, he struggled to formulate a question, trying to understand what exactly the ancient god meant, what secret plans were hidden behind his demand. Lavaine sighed deeply, as if tired of the endless human misunderstanding, then slowly walked away, muttering under his breath with a hint of mocking contempt that humans had been using rituals for thousands of years, but they still remained blind to their true nature. They were still fools. Even in that tense moment, standing before the mighty god, Bartold continued to skillfully pretend, playing the role of a caring father, repeating that he was doing everything for the sake of his daughter, but his false words remained empty. They could not hide the truth. The noblewoman stood there, barely containing the rage that burned within her. Her eyes were wide open, and there was an expression of malice mixed with genuine horror, as if the encounter with something insurmountable had made her feel both fear and implacable hatred. The ruler of the empire, as if he knew no fear, with a gesture of complete confidence pointed his finger at the young man, who was not a simple man, but the supreme god, and without blinking, said that he was obliged to obey him, to fulfill each of his words, as befits someone of lower rank. Levain's face darkened, a dark shadow falling over his features, as if the darkness itself responded to his indignation. He did not at all like that a mortal dared to tell him how to act, trying to subdue someone whose power knew no limits. The man felt a chill run through his body. He tried with all his might to suppress his fear, convincing himself that the demon he had summoned could not harm him, but even this thought did not save him from the paralyzing horror. Suddenly, the cunning Bartold grabbed his head, fell to his knees, and screamed in unbearable pain. It seemed as if his skull was about to shatter into pieces, and dark magic began to swirl around him, filling the air with thick, oppressive currents of power. Indifferently, with only the slightest hint of contempt in his voice, the handsome Levain called the ruler of the empire a fool and a nonentity, unworthy of even attempting to command someone whose will extended far beyond mortal understanding. Having no other choice, the vile Bartold fell back to his knees, shoulders slumped and head bowed before the higher powers in a gesture of submission, emphasizing his helplessness before the one who cannot be disobeyed. Behind him, as if guided by an unknown force, the high priest slowly sank onto the cold stone floor. His arrival was no coincidence. In his heart lived a desperate prayer addressed to the great deity, whose unlimited power could change the course of history. The priest, leaving behind his pride, with trembling hands and a sad expression on his face, fell prostrate before the noble lords, begging them to appeal to a higher power, as their lands were sinking into chaos, and the people, losing all hope, were perishing from hunger, war, and inevitable oblivion. In his kingdom, devastated by a merciless war and plunged into all-consuming chaos, thousands of people died every day. Fear ruled the mind, hunger tormented the body, and death reaped its harvest, leaving behind only the shadows of the living who had lost hope. And now the priest, full of despair, raised prayers to the young master, the god, behind whom stood the princess, whose fate seemed already predetermined, as well as the fate of the entire kingdom, on the verge of destruction. But these words made no impression on the young man, and so, with a cold detachment in his gaze, he only reminded him that he had neither interest nor desire to interfere in his destiny, because his misfortunes had no meaning or importance for him. Rudis wondered what horror would befall their lands if the deity really refused to help, what destruction would follow this refusal, and how many people were destined to perish in the fire of chaos if the higher power turned away from them. At that very moment, a strange revelation dawned on her. By some inexplicable miracle, she had remained alive after the bloody ritual, her body had not turned to dust, and the magical seal flickering on the ground had somehow not taken her soul. The priest, with his shoulders slumped and his heart heavy, admitted the obvious. God did not want to help them, and if that was really the case, what would become of them now? What awaited the kingdom, abandoned to its fate without divine intercession? Levain, not hiding his mockery, said out loud that since Rudis had been sacrificed in this ritual, then his power, contrary to the expectations of others, now belonged to her, and not to those who tried to manipulate fate. The priest was shocked to the core of his soul by the words he heard. His gaze slowly slid towards the emperor, in an attempt to find on his face at least a glimmer of understanding or awareness of what was happening. But he was only met with a reflection of confusion and anger. The ruler, who was still kneeling, could not believe what he was hearing. His mind refused to accept reality, and so he furiously called the young man's words absurd nonsense, refusing to admit that the fate of the kingdom now depended on his own daughter. And only now did it occur to the man that if he truly wanted to save his country from destruction, if he longed for mercy for himself and his people, then he had no choice but to bow before the one he despised and humbly ask for her help. After a few agonizing moments filled with oppressive silence, Bartold, unable to suppress his pride, left the room with a grim expression, his footsteps echoing in the cold space, leaving the princess alone with the young man. The priest, realizing that there was no other way out, with tears of relief in his eyes, but with a warm and sincere smile, decided to support the princess and heal her, because she was the one who would now become the key to saving the kingdom. Under the god's watchful gaze, he carefully took Rudy's tender hand, trying to help her up. His touch was light but sure, as if the air around her was permeated with an invisible force, protecting her from falling and weakening again. Glancing quickly at the girl out of the corner of his eye, Levane noticed that despite the apparent calm, it was worth remaining alert, because there was always someone who could commit another imprudence, which would lead to even greater consequences. The noblewoman, slowly watching the god leave the hall, involuntarily stopped her gaze on the huge door, watching as it slowly closed behind him, leaving only her, the priest, and the silence filled with the echo of the events that had taken place in the room. The priest, busy healing the girl, did not quite understand what to do now, but only one thing was clear. After Mr. Levane left, the air in the room seemed to become cleaner and breathing suddenly became easier, as if an invisible weight had fallen. After the treatment, the saint, with a slight and kind smile, offered to accompany the lady back to her chambers, hoping that after everything she had been through, she needed at least a little peace and solitude to recover. The beauty frowned in displeasure and, crossing her arms, explained with evident irritation that she did not at all want to return to the room that had been assigned to her, because it was her sister's, with whom she had always had a tense and difficult relationship. All those noble women who had previously knelt down, begging for help, had only pretended to be benevolent. And now that the threat had passed, there was not a drop of sincerity left in their gazes, and their smiles were nothing more than masks that hid indifference and lies. The graceful female fingers, once relaxed and graceful, trembled from inner tension until they clenched into strong fists, as if reflecting the storm of emotions that was bursting forth, and the priest, watching her attentively, understood without words what heavy feelings were tearing at her soul. Raising her head sharply at the unexpected proposal to dine together, the princess broke the silence and, narrowing her eyes, suggested going to the temple of God instead, clearly not wanting to waste time on idle chatter. The young man, feeling the weight of guilt that oppressed his heart, understood that he himself had once been part of the ritual that had brought him suffering, and that was why now, even if it was late, he wanted to atone for his mistake and at least try to make amends for his guilt. It was a real revelation for the lady to hear from the young man's lips that not even the emperor himself had the right to bring knights into the sacred halls of the temple without the deity's permission, for she had no idea before how strict this law was. The priest, who had expected to see only hatred and indignation in her eyes, suddenly froze in astonishment at the princess's words of thanks, for he had been prepared for accusations, but not for her unexpected gratitude. But Rudy's was neither angry nor resentful. On the contrary, she was genuinely glad that the man had found the strength to apologize for the pain he had caused her, and instead of reproach or coldness, a warm and light smile blossomed on her face, full of acceptance and understanding. The princess's unexpected reaction almost made the young man cry, for he had expected anger or contempt, but instead he found a kindness that seemed truly infinite, too pure for a person who had experienced so much suffering. The high priest, surrounded by other adepts, stood at the entrance of the church and greeted the guests with due respect, his voice sounding even and solemn, as if the sacred monastery itself were speaking through the lips of its ministers. Rudy's gratefully accepted the attention and expressed his appreciation for having a spacious and bright room to live in, and his smile, full of gratitude, seemed so sincere that everyone around him felt a warm peace. However, as soon as she was left alone, lightness instantly gave way to fatigue and, sighing deeply, the girl fell exhausted onto the soft bed, finally allowing herself to relax after a long day filled with anxiety. Closing her eyes, the young woman heard the voice of that same God again in her mind, reminding herself of his words that her power now belonged to her, and the realization of this washed over her with a wave of an unknown and terrifying premonition. The noble woman no longer wanted to be a puppet in her father's hands, walking around chained, following only his will, obeying without the right to vote, and at that moment a firm decision was born in her heart to break those invisible ties once and for all. Suddenly, in the silence, the voice of a servant was heard, informing him that the emperor himself had arrived in the chambers, and concealing the alarm which had broken out under a mask of calm, Rudis allowed him to enter with restraint, showing neither fear nor hesitation. The figure of the man who entered her room seemed dark and terrifying, as if he brought with him the night itself, and his imposing presence was oppressive, while the princess remained unperturbed, sitting on the bed and not looking away. The ruler's face was covered in darkness, as if the night itself was reflected in his features, and malice, tension, and a chilling coldness reminiscent of an evil omen emanated from him, and his entire aura, filled with hidden rage, exuded an oppressive menace. But the lady had already made a final decision. From now on, she would not allow herself to show weakness, she would not cower under his heavy gaze, and she would not be afraid of the one who had considered her all her life only a tool to achieve his goals. And suddenly, breaking the usual order of things, the emperor spoke, but not imperiously, not coldly, but differently, for the first time in his entire life, addressing her not as a pawn, not as a subject, but calling her by the word she had never heard him say, daughter. Earlier, the noblewoman's sister was in a dark room, surrounded by the chaos of scattered books, and trembling from the emotions that overwhelmed her, she cried silently, burying her face in the bed, unable to contain the bitterness that gnawed at her heart. The ruler of the empire came in person to apologize to his daughter for his harshness and rudeness, for the scream that escaped before he had time to realize how much he hurt her. But will his words be able to change anything now? The first attack occurred 3 years ago when a crimson bolt of lightning streaked across the sky from the eastern lands, illuminating the city in an ominous light, foreshadowing the disasters to follow, like someone's inexorable punishment. The power of the once seemingly unshakable empire began to rapidly fade, the crown lost its strength, and the power of the imperial family weakened every day, clinging to its former greatness with trembling fingers. The man gritted his teeth in frustration, remembering how he had recently been convinced that by sacrificing the useless, as he considered, Rudis, he could return his lost power. But now that everything had changed, that thought only caused him anger and bitterness. Bartold, overwhelmed by despair, made an oath to his beloved daughter that, whatever the cost, he would not allow the country to disappear without a trace into the abyss of oblivion. He would fix everything. He would find a way to return to his former power, even if it meant making unimaginable sacrifices. Now the emperor sat across from Rudis at a heavy oak table, and a tense, oppressive silence fell between them, speaking louder than any words, but neither of them was in a hurry to break it first. This time the ruler did not raise his voice, did not shower his daughter with angry reproaches, but, on the contrary, for the first time in his life, he called her by this warm word, daughter, and calmly told her about the fact that she now possessed the power that allowed her to control the very power of the deity. The princess frowned, then smiled sadly, fully aware that her father had simply changed tactics, now trying not to bully her, but to gain her favor, because recently he had beaten her, scorned her, and treated her like dirt, and now he was suddenly trying to be gentle. The girl froze when the man, without hiding his calculations, said that if she remained by his side, if she was faithful to the family and the crown, then he would always treat her with the same kindness, with the same warmth as he had previously spoken to her sister, reminding her of what she never had. Unable to bear the irony of the situation, the girl sitting at the table laughed softly. Her laugh was bitter, but there was an undisguised mockery in it, as if she had only now realized the absurdity of what was happening, and for her it was even funnier than it should have been. Then Bartold narrowed his eyes darkly, staring intently at his daughter, and asked in a hoarse voice what exactly it was that she found so amusing in her words. But there was not a drop of good nature in his voice, only cold irritation and hatred. Placing her hand on her chest, as if trying to calm the sudden surge of emotion, the beauty calmly but firmly explained that after everything that had happened, that man no longer had the right to be called her father, that she had lost him the very moment he betrayed her, and now she didn't even want to see him in front of her. The ruler of the empire was clearly displeased with this response. A dark shadow of irritation ran across his face, his hands clenched into fists, and his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth could be heard grinding. And at that moment it was clear that his anger was about to explode. But Rudy's, paying no attention to the growing tension, only indifferently added that it was high time they stopped this pathetic farce, because she was not going to play their games, and, besides, there was only one thing she really wanted to achieve. The emperor, looking tensely at his daughter, who now seemed completely different to him, terribly unpredictable, felt a growing anxiety gnawing at him from within and, hiding his irritation behind an icy calm, after a long pause, he asked her what she wanted. It could have been anything: a pile of precious stones, dresses made of expensive fabrics that rustled like the wind, or perhaps a chance to take revenge on those who once looked down on her, failing to recognize her dignity and considering her just a shadow in this world. The ruler, clenching his teeth until they gnashed, sighed deeply, without taking his intense gaze off the one he considered insignificant, and yet he could not help but wonder what this girl, pitiful at first sight, could want, who dared to stand before him and demand the impossible of him. The noblewoman sitting in front of the ruler did not show the slightest excitement. She only straightened her back and, giving him a piercing glance, said coldly and clearly that her demands were unwavering and there were only 3, but each one would change this world. The man smiled coldly and cruelly, calling his daughter an unfortunate creature of darkness, an insolent and reckless monster who dared to set conditions for the one whose will determined the fate of people, to whom the empire itself belonged, whom not even the gods dared to contradict. Rudy's, without batting an eyelid, calmly asked his father to moderate the ardor that had erupted within him and to humble his pride. For if he did not retract his arrogant position and curb the rage that was burning within him, he ran the risk of never receiving what he so longed for with all his being. There was no turning back, there was no room for doubt, and all that was left was to take a step forward, following the faint light of hope that pierced the thick, merciless darkness that covered their future with a dark cloak. The lady had not just one, but 2 trump cards in her hands, and all she had to do was decide exactly how to play them in this tense battle of wits, in this game without rules, where power over the empire and the fate of those who were drawn into this inevitable whirlwind of events were at stake. Initially, his wish was simple and irrevocable. He wanted Selena to be the next victim of the ritual rite, but now that the deity had already been summoned and his will had imprinted the destiny of mortals, this no longer made the slightest sense, and his plans changed. The second letter that fell into her hands was much more dangerous, and, slightly bowing her head, the princess asked her father with feigned thoughtfulness what the reaction of the church and the entire clergy would be when they learned that he had treated her, his daughter, as not an heiress. His lips twisted into a cruel, cold smile as he calmly, yet with terrifying confidence, added that the common people, upon learning of such a vile act by the ruler, might not only be outraged, but even rise up in rebellion and stage a coup d'etat. Bartold could no longer contain himself, he could not hide his rage, and with his face twisted in anger he cursed rudely, profaning her name with insults full of hate because his soul burned at the realization that she, that pathetic girl, dared to threaten him. Taking a deep breath, however, she forced herself to remain silent, clenching her fists until her fingers were white, and narrowing her eyes, she asked in a hoarse voice what this noble woman was ultimately trying to achieve. But even in this question there was tension, for she was afraid of taking a step that might once again provoke the deity's wrath. With her head bowed and her eyes hidden from view, the beautiful girl sighed softly, making it clear that she did not crave gold, power, or support from the man who had once been called her father, for all that he could give her was now worthless to her. Staring at his reflection in the depths of his refreshing cup of tea, Rudy's calmly but firmly explained to him that from now on he was obliged to speak to her with due respect if he truly intended to make a deal with her, because there was no longer any room for humiliation in this world. Bartold finally realized that he would have to listen to his daughter, even if every sentence she said cut through his pride like a sword, and, trembling with suppressed anger, he forced out a tense question, demanding that she explain to him what exact conditions she was going to present to him. But as soon as he heard the answer, his patience broke down. The emperor jumped out of his seat, unable to hide his rage, because it was unthinkable to him that the lady dared to plan to use such great power, granted from above, just to protect the empire and get rid of the monsters. The second condition that escaped from her scarlet lips was the desire to leave the confines of the palace forever, to go as far away as possible, to where the walls of that cold place could no longer chain her freedom and remind her of the past she intended to leave behind. Rudis, looking straight into his father's eyes, calmly explained that he intended to move to another duchy that did not intersect with the empire's territories, where his name would no longer be a heavy burden, where he could start a new life, free from the old chains. The third condition was the final step toward a complete breakup. She made it clear that she wanted to break out of the cage that had held her back for years once and for all, and with that decision came the realization that it was time to leave, cutting all the ties that had once connected her to this family. The Arcto Duchy, which he intended to go to, stood as a fortress of justice and nobility, and its symbol was a sword that shone with a pure blue light, personifying not only the courage of brave warriors, but also the unwavering righteousness of the ruler himself. Dulio Arctis, the leader of this house, was renowned for his unwavering honor, his graceful yet lethal fighting style, and the fact that he fought in war not for power, but to protect his people, whose loyalty to him was unwavering. Rudis could not help but notice that a warm and trusting relationship had developed between Selena and the young man from the neighboring duchy, which meant that there was no reason for conflict between their lands, which only strengthened his confidence in the correctness of the decision he had made. Having finished stating her conditions, the beauty raised a calm but expectant gaze towards her rough father, giving him the opportunity to realize that there was no turning back, and now it was up to him alone what the next step would be in this silent game of chess. The emperor just looked at her in silence, as if trying to find a weakness in her words, but his silence spoke louder than any speech, because he had no choice but to resign himself and accept everything she demanded. Soon it was deep night, and a thick darkness enveloped the world like a soft but impenetrable blanket, and high in the sky, among the rare cold stars, the moon shone brightly, filling the silent streets and palace walls frozen in anticipation of change with silver light. Rudy sat in the Kremlin by the window, her posture impeccably calm and her hands resting carefully on her lap, as if not even this tense conversation could break her composure, although deep down she felt fatigue invading her, pressing down on her with a great weight. Finally, Bartold, unable to find any other way out, gritted his teeth, reluctantly agreed to all her conditions, and without deigning to say another word to his daughter, quickly left the room, leaving behind only the painful echo of his footsteps. The beauty closed her eyes tiredly, allowing herself to relax for a moment because all this oppressive and exhausting conversation had absorbed the last of her strength, making her feel the weight of every word that had been said that night. But suddenly her body began to tremble treacherously, as if something inside her had suddenly broken, rolling like an invisible wave through every cell, and overcome by a sudden weakness, she felt herself losing control of her own movements and staggered. The woman's body almost fell, sinking into unconsciousness, but at that very moment, strong male hands caught her gently but safely, preventing the fragile silhouette from falling to the ground, holding her in the chair, as if carefully protecting her from the inevitable fall. It was Levane who had come to the palace that night to see the noblewoman whose name continued to echo in his thoughts, and he was now standing beside her, watching intently as the moonlight slid across her tired face, softening her features slightly. Without a second thought, he carefully bent down, lifted the exhausted princess into his arms, feeling her lightness, as if she were woven from fragile shadows, and, without wasting any time, carried her away, to where the rooms would finally give her the rest she so desperately needed. With special tenderness, he laid her down on the spacious bed, surrounding her with soft scarlet pillows and cool silk sheets, allowing her exhausted body to drown in comfort, where fatigue would finally give way to long-awaited peace. His warm palm slid across her cheek, barely perceptibly brushing the loose strands of hair away from her face so that nothing would disturb her sleep. as if he wanted to preserve that moment of serenity, giving her the tenderness she had perhaps been deprived of for so long. Leaning closer, he whispered with his lips that she really deserved a break because she had tried very hard today, and, leaving only a faint trace of warmth, his silhouette dissolved into the air, as if dispersing into the sparkling moon dust. The lady's fingers trembled slightly, as if deep in her sleep her consciousness had caught echoes of the young man's words, penetrating the veil of oblivion, causing her heart to clench anxiously from a strange, yet incomprehensibly warm sensation. A nightmare was born in his mind, in which a cold horror was intertwined with an inexplicable attraction. His companion's bloody hand slowly touched his cheek, leaving on his skin a sticky trail of another person's death, and that gesture was at the same time terrifying and hypnotic. Levane stood before her, his clothes soaked in the crimson blood of his enemies, and his eyes shining with fanatical devotion, and he, without looking away, asked what Rudis wanted, making it clear that for her he was willing to cross any line. But the beauty herself lay among the broken bodies, surrounded by the remains of those who dared to become her enemies, and breathing heavily, she whispered with her lips that she only wanted one thing, that no one could hurt her again, but part of her words were lost in the whisper of the wind. Morning came. A soft, golden light penetrated through the high windows, filling the rooms with a warm glow, and its rays, passing through the heavy scarlet curtains, created a strange play of shadows, announcing the beginning of a new day. The huge carved table still bore the marks of a recent meal. Many empty plates with delicate designs, dim candles whose flames had gone out, leaving only thin wisps of smoke, and the faint aroma of fresh bread still hanging in the air. Rudy sat at the table, looking at the tea set, while an adult priest, dressed in strict robes, slowly filled his cup with a dark amber-colored drink, and the steam from the hot tea rose, dissolving into the morning air. The noblewoman carefully brought the cup to her lips, feeling the warmth of the porcelain on her palms, and taking a slow sip, she closed her eyes for a moment, enjoying the acidic taste of the drink, which for a moment allowed her to forget herself amidst the chaos of recent events. With a barely perceptible noise, she lowered the cup back onto the saucer, the sound echoing throughout the room, breaking the silence. And at that moment her fingers trembled slightly, as if to indicate that the thoughts tormenting her mind had not yet completely abandoned her. A slightly awkward smile appeared on her face as she looked away and carefully asked the priest if he would allow her to walk alone, wanting to be alone with her own thoughts for a while, to feel the air of freedom. Before her lay magnificent gardens, paved paths leading to majestic staircases, arches intertwined with greenery and flowers that shone with brilliant colors, as if inviting her into their world, where beauty remained untouched by intrigue and fear. The noblewoman walked slowly along the path, wrapped in a warm cloak, her breath dissolved in the fresh morning air, and around her spread an image of peaceful beauty. Not far away was a pond planted with delicate lotuses. The water seemed serene, but suddenly the silence was broken by a familiar voice, sounding very close, someone calling her name, and obeying the impulse, the girl instantly turned around, her heart stopping for a moment before starting to beat faster. Levane stood before her, his gaze filled with a mysterious and calm confidence, and holding out his hand, he gently called her to follow him, without explaining anything. But this invitation was enough for her to nod without hesitation and take a step forward. As if by the will of the gods, snow began to slowly fall from the sky, enveloping the flower beds, paved paths and outstretched trees in white blankets in a matter of moments, and the light, icy air intertwined with her hair, tangling the silky strands. He walked forward, pushing his way through the swirl of snowflakes that danced chaotically around him, as if the heavens themselves had decided to hide the truth from him, and the piercing wind burned his skin with icy touches as his gaze desperately wandered in search. It was only when her feet sank into the deep snow next to a lone tree that she finally noticed Levane was there, staring at her silently, not a single emotion flickering on his face, and the thin shirt clinging to his body giving not the slightest sign that he felt cold. The charming man obediently turned in her direction as soon as she called him, drawing her attention to himself, and at that very moment her gaze softened and a light, almost weightless smile appeared on her large lips, as if the boy had been waiting for that loud call. Levain looked at her warmly, but with a subtle mockery in his eyes, and, tilting his head, he asked her gently if she had managed to rest after everything that had happened, as if there were no secrets between them, and he knew her answer in advance. The noblewoman froze, her fingers involuntarily gripping the hem of his cloak, and a brooch gleamed coldly on her chest, as if reminding her of their recent conversation, and her heart began to beat faster when she realized that the young man was clearly aware of her father's arrival, even though she hadn't said a word to him about it. The handsome man instantly picked up on her shift in mood, the subtle hint of tension in her gaze, and narrowing his eyes with undisguised interest, he asked her directly, "Does she find him suspicious, since he knows so much about her, as if he were watching her every step?" The noblewoman nodded awkwardly in agreement, feeling the tension that limited her movements, and her thoughts ran back and forth in disarray, trying to find at least some justification for her indecision, but every phrase that came to mind seemed unconvincing and empty. God, remaining unperturbed, only calmly explained that he had not been able to go ahead until now because the princess had not bothered to tell him clearly what exactly she wanted to obtain from him and what goals she had set for him, and without her will, he would not be able to act with all his strength. The lady, looking away in embarrassment, cautiously admitted that she did not know exactly how the young man would act if, despite everything, she expressed her true desires to him, and therefore, fearing his unpredictable decisions, she preferred to remain silent, avoiding the need to make a final decision. But the god suddenly interrupted her words, gently but confidently pointing out that everything turned out to be much simpler than she imagined, and that there was no point in wasting so much energy worrying when the answer was right in front of her, waiting only for one bold step forward. Gesturing with his hand toward the girl, he warned her that he wanted to give her a visual example so that she would better understand the essence of his words, and without wasting any time, he advanced slowly, leaving behind footprints in the snowdrifts, as step by step he approached her, standing next to the old tree. When the distance between them shortened, the man, without taking his eyes off her, suddenly asked her a simple but seemingly significant question. "What time of year do you like most? What awakens warm feelings in your heart?" The lady, a little embarrassed, looked down, thought for a moment, before quietly admitting that spring had always been the most precious time of the year for her, because it was at this time that nature came to life, giving hope for a new beginning. Hearing her answer, Levain narrowed his eyes mischievously and, with a slight, somewhat mocking smile on his lips, nodded, as if confirming his own thoughts, and then calmly pointed out that he had no doubt about it because he had already guessed before that spring had always been her favorite season. Suddenly, the noblewoman raised her head sharply, and her gaze was filled with genuine surprise. Right before her eyes, in the middle of the snowy landscape, on the bare branches of an old tree, delicate flowers began to bloom, as if spring had suddenly arrived against all the laws of nature. The lush scarlet and pink buds opened one after another, exuding a subtle and charming aroma that filled the air around them, creating a feeling of something almost magical, as if time itself had been subjected to someone else's will. Calmly observing her reaction, the young man explained with a slight smile that one of his abilities allows him to control the age of objects and living beings. For example, he can make a tree bloom despite the depth of winter, changing its flow of time. But then the boy slowly extended his hand, and one of the bright petals, finding itself between his fingers, suddenly began to darken, wrinkle, and crumble into dust, as if it had lived a long life in just a moment before disappearing forever. The noblewoman, standing in amazement, could not hide her surprise. The god's abilities turned out to be far greater than she could have imagined, and the realization of his power made her hold her breath in amazement at what she saw. Levain, looking directly into the noblewoman's eyes, said without a shadow of a doubt that he was willing to carry out any of her orders as long as it was within his capabilities, because his purpose was to obey her will and make her wishes come true. Rudy's froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and his eyes widened in shock. betraying doubt. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, realizing how much power he now had in his hands and what a burden could fall on his shoulders. The young man, noticing her confusion, gently added that, for all his power, he was not an omnipotent being. His magic had its limits, and even he was not able to change everything in this world with a snap of his fingers. At that moment, the girl felt a magic circle awaken in her body, glowing with a soft pink light, as if reminding her that the deity had already accepted her instructions, which meant that her will was now an absolute law for him. Finally, taking a deep breath, the noblewoman raised her head firmly, met his gaze, and spoke her first words of command. She wanted him to save the empire from the monsters, because if anyone could do it, it was him. The young man, with a slight mockery in his gaze, bowed his head, studying the expression on her face, and shaking his head, declared that he did not believe in the sincerity of her wish, because his ears heard lies, and so he ordered her to tell him the true request, which came from the depths of her heart, without fear or hesitation. Dear Rudy's froze, her lips parted, but the words refused to leave her tongue, because she could not understand if there was any difference between her personal desires and the good of the empire, if she should not put other people's fates above her own whims. Lavaine, smiling, said in a low but insistent voice that he could wish for anything, because his existence served the fulfillment of his will, whatever it was. Selfish, meaningless in the eyes of others, because divine power does not judge desires. The confused noblewoman looked down, nervously clenching her fingers, and in a trembling voice admitted that she had no idea what she really wanted, because all her life her desires had been determined by others, and now, when opportunities opened up before her, for the first time she felt lost. In the palace, all eyes were always on Selena. Her presence illuminated the halls, forcing everyone to admire her beauty, and Rudy's, like a shadow, remained on the sidelines, not attracting attention, and at those moments she felt as if the world was deliberately putting her in second place. Tears rolled down her cheeks in great drops, and as she looked out of the window into the endless distance, she suddenly remembered her old, almost forgotten wish to leave this cold palace and go as far away as possible, to a place where there would be no burden of court intrigue or foreign expectations. The young man, seeing her reaction, chuckled, a slight mockery sounding in his voice, and calmly said that this could not be the girl's true wish, because if she truly wanted to leave with all her heart, she would have left this place long ago without looking back. Suddenly her ear caught someone's mysterious voice. It sounded soft but insistent, calling her by name and convincing her that the time had come to free herself from the shackles, escape from here forever and finally be truly free, but where those words came from she did not understand. The bright rays of the sun painfully cut into her eyes, forcing her to close them, and, covering her face with her hand, she tried to hide from the blinding light, but an inner anxiety did not leave her, as if she had a premonition that that day would be the beginning of something inevitable. Although Rudy's was not yet fully aware of what exactly he wanted from life, and his thoughts were still confused, one thing he knew for certain: more than anything in the world, he longed for freedom, the kind that would allow him to live according to his own choice, without the shackles of duty and the expectations of others. The man, watching her reaction closely, nodded with a slight smile, agreeing to fulfill her wish, because those were the words he was waiting for from her, and they were finally spoken, like a seal, sealing their mysterious connection that had existed long before this moment. Approaching the girl, he looked her straight in the eyes, and in his gaze one could read not only trust, but also something deep, incomprehensible, after which he asked her in a low but insistent voice to relax, allowing herself to let go of her worries at least for a moment. Lavaine slowly embraced her, touching her with the warmth of his palms, and then, leaning down, touched her forehead with his lips, whispering that he had been waiting for this moment for 5,000 years, and now that she had finally expressed her wish, he would fulfill it no matter what the cost. Feeling the heat rise to her cheeks, the girl asked, not hiding her excitement, carefully if this meant she would have to accompany him to the war zone to see with her own eyes the destruction he would cause by facing the monsters. However, the young man simply waved his hand casually, noting with a slight smile that the main difficulty was not in his strength at all, but in the state of his body, which still did not allow him to fully fight off the monsters as the situation required. Rudy's, having difficulty choosing his words, tried to explain that he could not leave the palace early because his disappearance would have caused chaos, and not only in the royal family, but also among the nobility, because the princess's escape would have caused confusion and panic. Then, having collected her thoughts, the girl timidly asked him if he could do anything for her at least now, but hearing a soft refusal, she only nodded silently, and Levane added that if she ever needed anything, she had only to say so, and he would immediately come to her aid. With these words, the young man disappeared into the air, leaving the girl alone in the middle of the garden, where only the wind, gently playing with her hair, was the only silent witness to her thoughts, hidden in the depths of her heart. The Duchy of Arcto, famous for its power, was a majestic city with wealthy districts where luxurious buildings stood, and in the very center, as a symbol of power, stood the majestic royal palace. In the spacious room, where soft candlelight reflected off the smooth surface of the polished oak table, sat an elegant porcelain cup filled with hot tea, from which a subtle, spicy aroma rose, enveloping the air in a light mist of comfort and peace. Selena clenched her slender fingers into fists in irritation, her nails digging into her palms when she heard from the servants that the Duke had refused to meet with her, citing urgent matters, and this news only intensified the storm of indignation boiling in her soul. The princess could hardly restrain herself from trembling with indignation, her slender fingers clenched convulsively into fists, and her bosom heaved heavily with indignation, for she had been waiting patiently for nearly an hour, dressed in a scarlet gown decorated with jewels, but he still had not deigned to appear. However, suddenly, the silence was broken by the voice of a servant, solemnly announcing the arrival of Seraphis, and at that very moment the anger disappeared from Selena's face, replaced by sincere joy, and her heart fluttered in anticipation of the long-awaited meeting. Jumping out of her seat, barely restraining herself from running away, Selena walked quickly towards the young man, whose silhouette had already appeared in the doorway, and her heart fluttered with anticipation at this unexpected encounter. Seraphis was a young man whose youth and beauty were striking. Thick brown curls fell lightly over his forehead, a silver gaze under long eyelashes seemed penetrating, and his uniform emphasized his majestic figure because he was the grandson of the Duke himself. However, contrary to the lady's expectations, he showed neither joy nor warmth at the meeting, but, on the contrary, said rudely and distantly that he had come only because she had been waiting for him so insistently, not wanting to leave that place, and his words sounded like a reproach. The aristocrat froze, her lips stretching into an incomprehensible smile. Normally, their communication was easy, almost friendly, but now there was a coldness in his voice that she had never felt before, and it confused her. Seraphis, noticing her confusion, merely smiled and, looking her straight in the eyes, said that he would like to hear her answer. How would she treat a man who would betray her feelings and trample on her love, leaving nothing of him except ashes? The girl stood paralyzed, her gaze clouded by a growing incomprehension, and her heart tightened painfully in her chest, and, with a trembling voice, she began to ask why he said such things, because she had never betrayed him, remaining faithful to her feelings. Seraphis looked down in disappointment, didn't say another word. Instead, he turned abruptly and walked quickly away from the princess, tossing a dry comment over his shoulder about how he didn't have time, because it was time to go, and his voice sounded distant, as if he had already closed his heart to her. He gripped the door handle tightly, cold and worn by time, about to step forward and leave that place, when a tension hung in the air, as if fate itself was trying to hold him back in that moment before he finally left. However, his steps were suddenly interrupted by a heart-rending cry from the girl in which pain, resentment, and despair were mixed. She demanded an answer, wanting to understand why he had treated her so cruelly, and begged him to at least say a word to her before leaving. Seraphis, without expressing a shadow of emotion, only said briefly that he had received an important message from the high priest himself, and that therefore he could not waste time on further conversation. His duty called him, and in comparison to it, any personal conversation seemed insignificant. The door behind the boy slammed shut with a heavy, thunderous sound, separating his figure from the room, where now only the girl remained. Alone between the empty walls, and the silence that followed her departure seemed deafening, as if fate itself had put an end to this story. The soft light of day filtered through the window, penetrating the room with golden rays, as if reminding her that behind those walls the world was still alive. People went about their business, laughed, talked, and only there, in that corner, time stopped, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The priest, looking intently into the face of his interlocutor, asked him an important question: whether he had managed to find out whether it was possible to accept the patronage of the duchy, since much depended on it, including his future destiny and future. And indeed, Rudis, bowing her head in respect, with hope in her voice, asked to be accepted under the protection of the duchy temple, believing that it was there that she could find a new home, peace, and a place where fate would finally stop testing her with cruel trials. The young man nodded calmly, confirming that his request had been granted and was now officially accepted, and then, after a brief pause, he turned to the princess and asked if she knew the duke's grandson, whose name was Seraphis, and if they had ever had the chance to cross paths. The girl, frowning slightly, replied that she had no idea who he was and had never met him personally, but that she had heard several rumors about him more than once, although she was not sure how true they were and whether they were worth giving any importance to. The boy, looking thoughtfully to one side, said that he need not worry about the heir to the duchy, because despite all the speculation and gossip, this man would not cause him any harm, and his safety would not depend on his presence. Suddenly, clear and confident footsteps were heard in the corridor, breaking the silence, and at that moment the priest, slowly rising from his place, noticed with a slight smile that apparently Sir Seraphis had already arrived and would soon appear before them. The priests bowed in reverence as the high priest and princess slowly walked out of the chambers, surrounded by an aura of grandeur that caused those around them to hold their breath in respect for their high status. Then Seraphis, who was standing among them in the hall, looked at what was happening with slight surprise, and then, raising an eyebrow, asked if the emperor's daughter was really present here, as he had not expected such an important meeting in this place. Rudis, maintaining an impeccable posture, clasped her hands in front of her and greeted the heir of a noble family with impeccable courtesy, because in such circumstances every word and gesture had meaning and could influence the further course of events. The young man immediately bowed his head in acknowledgement of his mistake and sincerely apologized for his earlier rudeness, realizing his temporary lack of manners, which was unacceptable when dealing with a person of such high birth. And then, possessed of natural charm and noble bearing, he introduced himself, gallantly raised the lady's hand to his lips, and touching it gently, with firmness in his voice, delivered a solemn speech about how his loyalty to the empire was unwavering, and he would serve it until the end of his days. Raising his head, Rudy suddenly felt an inexplicable uneasiness, as if something in the air had changed, altering the usual order of things, and, seized by a strange premonition, he began to look around, trying to understand what the reason for this feeling of anxiety was. The woman's gaze stopped at a far corner of the palace corridor, where a familiar figure appeared around the corner. A girl lurked in the shadow of the columns, whose tense breathing and movements constricted by rage betrayed the intensity of the emotions she was trying in vain to hide. It was Selena, and with her fists clenched until her knuckles turned white, she couldn't take her blazing gaze off the scene unfolding before her, feeling jealousy eating away at her inside, because seeing how Seraphis behaved with Rudis was an unbearable experience for her. Meanwhile, the Duke's grandson suddenly noticed that the princess had suddenly frozen. Her facial expression had changed, and her gaze had absent-mindedly turned towards the distance, causing him to frown and turn his attention back to himself, not wanting to be distracted by extraneous thoughts. Despite the concern flashing in his eyes, the young man continued in a reserved manner, announcing that a special room had already been prepared for Rudis, furnished with his status and comfort in mind, where he could live comfortably for the duration of his stay here. The lovely noblewoman was delighted to know that she would finally have her own room, which no one could enter without her permission, and, most importantly, she would be away from her father's influence, which would give her the freedom she so desired. When she asked when she could move into her new home, the Duke's grandson replied with a slight smile that it all depended only on her wish, and that if she so desired, she could come there right now to settle into her new home without delay. Not wanting to miss such a rare opportunity, the noblewoman immediately made up her mind and without hesitation agreed to move right now, realizing that this was her chance to start a life in a new place, free from the shackles of the past. Bowing his head to the princess in respect, the young man said he would immediately escort her to her new home, the Grand Duchy of Arctis, where she would now live, surrounded by the peace and grandeur of this noble family. The carriage stopped at the entrance of an ancient church, its elegant contours reflected in the midday light, and beside the vehicle were two people, the princess herself and her companion, ready to embark on a journey that could change their destinies forever. There, in the distance, out of the corner of his eye, Rudis noticed a familiar silhouette. Selena was standing near the column, holding her breath, clearly trying to remain unnoticed, but at the same time watching them intently, as if her gaze was fixed on what was happening for some reason known only to her. The carriage, ready to depart, rested on sturdy wooden wheels, the door handle glistening in the sunlight, and its heavy molding gave the vehicle a stately, aristocratic appearance worthy of its high-ranking passengers. Finally, the young couple, without losing any time, climbed into the spacious carriage, and it, moving smoothly from its place, headed for the palace, leaving behind the priests who, bowing respectfully, followed them with long, thoughtful glances. The noblewoman, feeling a slight excitement, carefully drew back the luxurious scarlet curtain, revealing a panorama of new sights flashing outside the window, and with undisguised curiosity watched how the landscapes changed during her leisurely journey. Suddenly, a keen interest lit up in the beauty's eyes. A completely new world, full of grandeur, opened up before her, because for the first time in her life she left her home, leaving behind the walls that had chained her freedom since childhood and prevented her from seeing what was hidden beyond them. The streets of the city were astonishing in their magnificence. Majestic monuments rose up among spacious squares. The architecture of the buildings was refined and elegant, as if each stone contained the history of centuries, and the narrow alleys breathed the secrets of the past. The girl could not take her eyes off the window, enchanted not only by the beauty of the city landscapes, but also by nature, which gradually began to replace urban landscapes. Dense forests, spreading trees, and delicate flowers filled her heart with joy. When their carriage finally came to a stop, enveloped in the silence of expectation, the young man first stepped out gracefully and then, with his unfailing gallantry, leaned forward slightly, extending his hand to his companion to help her down. They finally arrived at the majestic Duchy of Arctis, and before them appeared a grandiose mansion, awash in luxury and grace of architectural art. Tall towers rose proudly towards the sky, and in front of the main entrance, servants lined up in respectful bow. Rudis looked at the majestic house and excitedly stepped forward, but losing concentration on her movements, she suddenly stumbled. Her light shoes slipped on the polished steps, and the next moment the girl felt herself losing her balance. However, the fall was not destined to happen. The young man, showing an ultra-fast reaction, confidently caught her, holding her tightly, not allowing her to fall, and their eyes met for a moment, capturing in the air a moment of unexpected closeness. Immediately, a magic circle of protection lit up on the lady's neck, which enveloped her in a soft glow, making her understand that divine power had once again saved her from trouble, and, feeling a slight blush on her cheeks, she silently thanked the heavens for this sign. Not wanting to delay any longer, young Rudis straightened up and, gaining confidence, walked forward resolutely, leaving the aristocrat behind, as if deliberately emphasizing that this house would now become her new place where she would build her future. With horror, as she felt cold sweat appear on her face, the girl realized that the old pain in her left leg had made itself felt again, piercing her with a sharp and unpleasant sensation, as if reminding her of the past she so wanted to leave behind. Noticing that the beauty was clearly tired after a long journey and could hardly contain her fatigue, the man, showing concern, firmly ordered the servants to disperse, making it clear that he himself intended to escort the lady to her chambers, not wanting to entrust this to someone else. The noblewoman, not wanting to reveal her inner weakness, only nodded silently in response, her gaze sliding to the side, avoiding meeting the stranger's eyes, perhaps out of embarrassment, or perhaps because at that moment each of her thoughts was drowning in an abyss of pain, exhaustion, and bitter thoughts. The room, prepared especially for the aristocrat, was astonishing in its grandeur, spacious, bathed in exquisite tones with a luxurious bed, graceful chairs and tables, as well as an elegant lamp whose soft lighting gave the space comfort and warmth. Rudis, having barely crossed the threshold, sat down with relief on the nearest chair, allowing herself to rest a little, and looking around at the new surroundings, finally said that the rooms suited her completely, expressing her moderate approval. Suddenly, the future duke, not hiding his anxiety, fell to his knees in front of the noblewoman. His gaze was tense, full of inner anxiety, as if he was trying to penetrate her soul and understand how much pain she had to endure before finding herself in front of him. Bowing his head and avoiding her gaze, the young man spoke in a calm, almost regretful voice, admitting that he had not even thought about the fact that they might need the help of healers, and dared to ask permission to examine the lady's wounded leg, hoping to somehow alleviate her suffering. Gritting her teeth, the girl bitterly admitted that the reason for her limp had nothing to do with a recent wound or bruise, as one might suppose, but was an innate characteristic that she had to live with since childhood, not knowing what ease of movement meant. Frowning slightly and not hiding his sincere surprise, the young man asked a question in incomprehension, trying to figure out what exactly the lady meant, hiding in those words something more than a simple admission of her weakness. With a slight smile tinged with sadness, Rudis calmly explained that such a disease was incurable. And no matter how hard the doctors tried, no matter how much they gave her hope, she knew that it was forever, and she could no longer change her destiny. Every night, barely opening her eyes because of the piercing pain, she whispered prayers under her breath, hoping that the gods would hear her pleas and finally free her from this endless torment, which each day sapped her strength and forced her to accept her own helplessness. The Duke, sitting beside her, listened to her attentively and, thinking, asked whether the Emperor himself, her father, had taken any measures, whether he had called the doctors to examine his daughter's leg and at least try to find a way to alleviate her suffering. Hearing only a cold, dry no as an answer, the man suddenly felt anger boil within him, realizing that the ruler, possessor of all possible power, did not even attempt to care for his daughter, leaving her to her grief, as if her fate did not matter to him. However, realizing that he had allowed himself to speak too harshly, the young man lowered his gaze, sighed, and apologized with sincere remorse for his lack of restraint, realizing that his harsh judgments could have caused her even more pain, although he did not want this at all. After gathering his thoughts, he firmly stated that if she did not object, he would take responsibility for her health himself and hire the best doctors to examine her and perhaps offer her some treatment that could alleviate her suffering. The noblewoman hesitated, not knowing whether to trust him, but the aristocrat, sensing her doubts, began to speak calmly of his experience in medicine, which he acquired on the battlefield among wounded soldiers, where every piece of knowledge could become a matter of life or death. Then, in a calm and respectful manner, he asked her if she would mind if he placed his hand on her knee to examine and assess her condition, assuring her that he would do everything as carefully and delicately as possible without causing her any discomfort. Pressing her fingertips into the hem of her dress, as if seeking some reassurance in the gesture, the sweet lady calmly but firmly replied that she was fine, making it clear that she did not wish to make any unnecessary noise about her long-standing problem. Having received such a restrained permission, But still, the handsome man gently but persistently ordered her to relax, breathe deeply, calm down, and not tense her muscles so that the examination would be carried out without unnecessary tension and embarrassment. His warm hands gently wrapped around her leg, the touch soft, almost gentle, and listening to her breathing, he asked her in a calm but confident voice if such contact hurt her, carefully observing her reaction. The noblewoman shuddered, but overcame herself and let out a barely audible confession that all was well, and only the faint sensation of his fingers through the fabric reminded her that he was really there, at that moment displaying a concern she had long been unaccustomed to. His hand tightened its grip on her leg, carefully but confidently turning it in different directions, trying to feel for possible damage, check the joints and assess how serious it was, but he didn't even imagine that his touches would cause an unexpected reaction. Suddenly, a loud, heart-wrenching scream escaped the noblewoman's lips, and the young man immediately froze, staring at her face in confusion, trying to understand if he had hurt her or something else had happened. His voice was filled with concern as he asked her if she was okay. The girl blushed to the tips of her ears, embarrassment taking over her entire being, and a seal of magic lit up on her skin, emitting a light, barely perceptible glow, as if revealing her true feelings. She gathered her courage and awkwardly asked him to let go of her leg. A look of genuine surprise crossed the young man's face, and a silent question froze in his eyes. He had not at all expected such a turn of events, and the realization of what was happening took him by surprise, causing him to lose the power of speech for a few moments. Bewildered, letting go of the beauty's slender leg, the young man frowned and, with evident surprise in his voice, asked what this mysterious magic symbol covering her neck and collarbones was, and how such a strange sign could appear on her body. The girl, staring into space in confusion, admitted with some uncertainty that she herself could not explain the origin of that seal, as it appeared suddenly, after a mysterious and dark sacrificial ritual, which she preferred not to talk about. The boy, having overcome a momentary stupor, stood up resolutely, looked at the girl with concern, and quietly said that the most important thing for her now was to get some rest, and in the meantime he would take care of her and bring her something sweet, asking the servants for a gift. Disappointed, but truly moved to the depths of her soul, Rudis bowed her head in thanks to the Duke's heir, expressing her gratitude for the kindness he had shown her, for the care she had not known for a long time, and for giving her the opportunity to find a new home and a sense of security. Seraphis stood frozen in a slight stupor because he hadn't really done anything significant for her, but despite this, the girl looked at him with such sincere gratitude that he even felt uncomfortable, and then quietly remarked that he should have spent more time resting. As the huge door slammed shut behind him with a soft echo, he slowly leaned his back against it, closed his eyes, and mentally noted how naive and sincere this princess was, as if she lived in a world where kindness and justice still existed. The emperor had always been known for his cruelty and inhumane methods of rule, but even he could not afford to threaten a neighboring duchy while the long-running war against the monsters continued, and having strong allies was vital to his crown. Rudy's existence itself was a blessing in disguise, as his birth marked a turning point in the fate of this world. He gained the power to end a protracted war that had ravaged the lands for years and claimed thousands of lives. Seraphis clenched his hands into tight fists as he realized just how much the emperor had driven his own daughter to fear, turning her life into a series of torments, and at that moment a passing servant with concern on his face cautiously asked if his master was feeling all right. Not wanting to show his emotions, Seraphis only briefly ordered the servants to immediately prepare for his guest not only tasty and nutritious food, but also new, warm clothes, because the winter in his area was harsh and he could not allow the girl to suffer from the cold. Bowing respectfully to the Duke's heir, the butler, with a serious expression on his face, assured him that the order would be carried out in the blink of an eye, and, without wasting any time, he hurried to take up the task that had been entrusted to him. Meanwhile, the young lady of the Viscount's family was sitting in her room, surrounded by curious listeners, and excitedly spreading rumors about how terrifying the process of escorting a guest to Selena's chambers was, and how terrifying the Emperor looked that day. Her interlocutor slowly and elegantly raised the cup to her lips, took a small sip of the aromatic tea, and thought for a moment, enjoying its delicate flavor and warmth before continuing the conversation. Ivana, as this refined lady was called, looked at her interlocutor with a slight smile and, slightly narrowing her eyes, calmly said that it was completely inappropriate for them, the simple servants of the princess, to interfere in political intrigues and try to understand the plans of people in power. The Viscount's daughter, suddenly struck by a conjecture, abruptly straightened up and blurted out with amazement in her voice that, most likely, all these strange events began to occur precisely after the mysterious and undoubtedly powerful summoning ritual. The conversation gradually turned to the topic of the ancient deity, and the noblewoman, taking another thoughtful sip of her drink, asked what information had been gathered about such a mysterious god, whose image was shrouded in secrets and ancient legends passed down by word of mouth. The two discussed how Selena could be the source of all those rumors about a false deity, and what had really happened at that fateful moment in the ritual when the boundaries between myth and reality seemed to become as blurred as shadows in the candlelight. But since Rudy's had managed to escape death, that could only mean one thing. The deity was real, because if it were mere fiction, how else could it be explained that he remained alive after the ritual was completed? Ivana, smiling maliciously, thought with evident contempt how naive and stupid Selena was, since she dared to defy the will of the deity itself, without realizing the depth of the consequences that could fall upon her for such a bold decision. Night enveloped the world in thick darkness, the gloom deepening behind the large windows, and the scarlet curtains, like frozen tongues of fire, swayed rhythmically in the air current, casting strange shadows on the iron bars, evoking a sense of anxiety and impending disaster. The lady's servants, glancing at their mistress with apprehension, dared to ask what action she was going to take, because if the rumors were really dictated by mere jealousy, this could have serious consequences for Ivana herself. But the noblewoman, interrupting her interlocutor, a girl named Giselle, with an indifferent gesture, made it clear that her concern was in vain, because the essence of the problem was not the princess at all, but the fact that an ancient deity had awakened from the depths of time. Giselle shuddered, involuntarily stepping back, because deep down she couldn't believe that this god was really real, and not a fictional image created by fear and superstition, centuries of feeding people's minds and making them see monsters where there are none. Running her slender fingers over the documents placed on the table, the aristocrat declared with cold determination that no matter what their doubts were, under no circumstances were they to go against the will of the deity, for such disobedience could bring consequences. In his letter, the lady's father made it clear that the true power of this ancient god was closely tied to Alpha, and that opposing him meant causing a disaster whose scale was difficult to even imagine. The duchy and the temple had long maintained peace and mutual respect between them, their alliance having remained intact for centuries, and if the deity had truly awakened, disturbing this fragile balance was not only dangerous, it could be a fatal mistake. Two hands firmly sealed the treaty, a firm handshake that symbolized the alliance that united the two powerful worlds, a sign of the inviolability and loyalty so necessary to maintain peace between the duchy and the great temple. Alpha was the name of the first document that sealed the union of the temple and the duchy, a brilliant book full of secrets and ancient knowledge, containing not only the most important laws and obligations, but also the key principles on which the future of both sides depended, determining their fate for many centuries to come. The beautiful Ivana, although she had not read the book, was sure that within its pages there would surely be a mention of the ancient deity they were now talking about, because contact with this being was too important for her cunning and vile plan. Giselle instantly straightened up, ready to hear the lady's new order as soon as it was addressed to her, realizing that her future behavior would depend on what kind of instructions she received from sweet Ivana at that moment. With a mischievous smile on her face, the intelligent noblewoman explained with a smile that she had an important matter that needed to be resolved in the near future, and it required immediate action because time was running out and the consequences could be serious. The long hallway of the mansion was shrouded in darkness, and in its depths, hidden from the eyes of casual witnesses, two figures were arguing heatedly, as if their words could change the very essence of what was happening, and neither opinion would yield to the other. One of the dark-cloaked figures, a man with obvious tension in his voice, tried to convince his companion that the information they were discussing was under the strict control of the temple and could not be revealed or distributed just like that without the knowledge of higher powers. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a strange voice, who with clear insistence asked if what they were discussing was really true, and his words instantly made them think, confirming that their conjectures and assumptions were perhaps not so far from the truth. It was the emperor himself, surrounded by his loyal guards, his stern face, deeply wrinkled and expressing furious anger, immediately attracted attention, making it clear that he was determined and willing to discover the whole truth without missing a single detail. The priest and the lady bowed deeply to the ruler, who demanded an immediate answer from them, asking if the truth they were speaking was in fact the truth, and their demeanor was full of respect and awe. The hooded saint, with a slight, barely perceptible smile on his face, confirmed that everything they had said was indeed true, but his words were loaded with such a hint of suspicion that they left everyone present with a feeling of unease. Soon, 3 years passed, and the Duke's mansion became even more beautiful, its majestic walls and spacious gardens perfectly matching the excellent weather that day, giving everyone present a feeling of warmth, peace, and comfort. The bewildered noblewoman, finding herself in that unfamiliar place, exclaimed in surprise that she had never heard of a place called Heart A, and could not understand how such a mysterious and unusual place ended up on her path, arousing curiosity and questions. Seraphis, sitting beside him, calmly and confidently explained that this was his first destination on a long journey, and that for all the strangeness of this place, it was an important step toward his goal, which had not yet been achieved. On the table were various dishes, delicacies, including fresh bread, aromatic sweets, and other delicacies, which created an atmosphere of comfort and hospitality. Their smells beckoned and promised satiety, satisfying any taste. The noblewoman shuddered as she knew they were heading to that place, realizing that now their lives would be indebted to them, and she, in turn, would be forced to fulfill some obligations that she might prefer to avoid because they imposed certain restrictions on her. An awkward silence hung between them, as if the very atmosphere of that moment, that strange and uncertain moment, forced them both to remain silent, and the silence became more and more noticeable, as if it enveloped them, not allowing them to continue the conversation. She did not want to interfere in the political affairs of others, because for her at that moment the main and only desire was one: to find her long-awaited freedom, to break the cages that chained her, and finally to feel the lightness she had dreamed of for so long. Gradually, the noblewoman, sensing the tension in the air, decided to ask what the Duke himself really thought about the political situation in the neighboring region of Heart A, because it was important for her to understand his opinion, which could significantly influence her actions and decisions. Rudis, evidently bewildered, asked him if he really had to go to that place, because he could not understand how his duty could be so important that it required such determination, and so easily justified such risks in an uncertain situation. Later, in the Great Hall, a meeting of the noble council was held at a round table where the aristocrats, dressed in exquisite clothes, sat with serious faces, awaiting the start of an important meeting that promised to be decisive for all those present. The emperor opened the meeting by saying that, as everyone already knew, the city of Harta had been chosen as the first point for the location and provision of aid to the deities, which gave the place a special significance and attracted the attention of the entire political elite. The man sat at the head of the table, where he was clearly visible to all, wearing a fur cloak that emphasized his status and strength, and his calm yet commanding presence brought order and calm to this important meeting. With a firm gaze that remained motionless, he added that everyone had gathered here to remove all uncertainties, differences, and finally gain the necessary discipline in political issues that had long required attention and decision. The aristocrats bowed their heads awkwardly and remained silent, immersed in a silence full of discomfort and tension, because they all knew that the conversation would probably touch on delicate subjects that they would prefer to avoid. They all did not particularly believe that the god was real and true, and not false, as many claimed, and in this context, Rudis's position became especially strong, because now she was the very high person who controlled this god, becoming more and more influential. The emperor, containing his rage, gritted his teeth, feeling his power and strength slipping away little by little, for now everything depended on the deity he himself had summoned, and who could at any moment snatch away his remaining power. Suddenly, a servant approached the ruler and quietly whispered the latest news that the long-awaited guest had finally arrived, and this news became a turning point that attracted the attention of everyone present, making them look forward to further developments. The man, hearing the latest news, announced loudly and authoritatively to all present that they must immediately let the guest in, and at that very moment all eyes instantly turned to the door, in anticipation of the appearance of someone who might bring new twists to the situation. Her long purple hair, adorned with a ribbon, fluttered in the wind as if the very branches of nature were reaching out to her, creating an image of lightness and refined grace, as if the elements themselves were emphasizing the importance of her presence at this important moment. It was Rudy's, who walked forward with elegance, and beside her, with restraint and confidence, walked the Duke's heir. They came to the meeting, and their appearance, restraint, and determination in their movements made it clear that they came here with a purpose. With his hands folded in front of him, the emperor greeted his daughter, the princess, with an indifferent and cold expression on his face as she entered the room, his gaze expressing neither joy nor excitement, as if he did not care about her presence. Rumors about the princess and her connection to the false god immediately began to spread throughout the room, which only increased the tension of the moment and gave rise to new questions that forced everyone gathered to search for answers to the unexpected events. Frowning, Bartold couldn't help but wonder why Rudy's had come here after thinking that she had left her family behind, and was now back in this room, raising questions that seemed like they should have been resolved a long time ago. Lady Rudis, with regret in her voice, protested, saying that it was not she who abandoned her family, but rather, it was the emperor who abandoned her, forcing her to leave, which turned everything that had been said before upside down and made her appear in a different light. Waving his hand in obvious displeasure, the man ordered them to get to the main topic and, without hiding his irritation, asked why he had come here, interrupting such an important meeting in which the key problems of his empire were being discussed. The beautiful noblewoman, looking up with determination and confidence, replied that she would rather choose another place for the god to move to than the city of Harta, believing that this decision could significantly change the course of future events. The ruler of the empire did not like this idea at all, since the city of Vigneault was exposed to all 5 stages of infection and its salvation was almost impossible, which complicated any attempts to restore it to its former state. Bartold laughed with barely perceptible contempt, saying that such a place was useless to save and that he never saw his daughter at the meetings, as she could barely understand the complex political issues discussed there. The lady, feeling that she had to answer the question, asked if her father had chosen the city of Hart solely because they were in desperate need of help, so that those who provided assistance would be indebted to the empire, which seemed like a logical decision. His last words, spoken in a light but confident tone, were the affirmation that it was in this city where all the nobility, the upper bourgeoisie, and the influential people were concentrated, who in the future could reward them for such an important service as saving the city. The entire noble company within the hall was frozen in complete silence. None of those present dared to respond, for it was a bitter truth that could not be refuted, and everyone understood that the lady's words faithfully reflected the reality of their situation. Suddenly, the white-haired earl, hunched over in indignation, protested, saying that the princess should not have insulted them in that way, for how could she even think that they were saving the city for money, when they were acting from the noblest of motives? Rudis mockingly asked the gentleman if he really thought that the City of Heart needed help more than Vigneault, because his view of the situation was completely different, and he found it difficult to believe in such a unilateral decision. The man loudly stated that the girl simply did not understand all the subtleties and hidden nuances of what was happening, and that was why she behaved so naively and inexperiencedly, not realizing that her every word and decision here had serious and far-reaching consequences for everyone present. The aristocrats, sitting in their chairs, instantly supported the count, exclaiming that the princess was certainly unreasonable and did not have sufficient understanding of the political situation, which was obvious to anyone who was even remotely aware of all the subtleties of what was happening. Everyone present began to look at the lady with obvious disdain, as if she were an insignificant figure among them, and spoke mockingly, claiming that she should have focused on preparing for her departure instead of trying to interfere in such complex matters. Suddenly, another voice was heard, calling attention and ordering to stop once and for all these useless disputes, which only distracted from the solution of the main problem, and calling on everyone to a unified and more constructive approach. Shocked, Rudis turned around abruptly, recognizing the familiar voice that had spoken those words, and instantly realizing who exactly was speaking, she felt a deep surprise and shock, because in front of her was the person she had not expected to meet at that moment. He was a young man with red hair, his bangs falling to one side, and the firm look in his dark eyes and his stubborn posture gave him a determined and confident appearance, as if he were ready to face anyone who dared to challenge his opinion. Suddenly, the Earl sprang up from his seat, slammed his fist on the table, and in a voice full of anger, demanded whether the charming Lord Abbot was in his right mind, saying things which, in his opinion, were completely absurd and could not correspond to common sense. The man waved his hand to the side, as if to dismiss the Count's outrage, and calmly said that this could be discussed even with a small child, who would no doubt agree that helping the town of Vigneault would bring far more benefit than supporting Hart. Abbot, looking haughtily at the other aristocrats gathered in the room, asked disdainfully whether they had really all gathered for such an insignificant reason, considering that discussing a matter that, in his opinion, was obvious, did not deserve their attention at all. Rudis confirmed that, as the Count had said, the first destination for aid should be Vigneault, since this city was in a much more critical situation than Harta and needed much more support. The Emperor had no choice but to object, as it was clear to everyone that Vigneault was in a much worse position, and after some thought, he reluctantly accepted the proposal, realizing that he could not ignore this fact. The ruler said mockingly that he found it difficult to understand how the lady still remained in doubt, even though she had already accepted all his conditions, and now her position did not seem as secure and decided as before when she spoke in protest. His gaze remained cold and penetrating, as did his words, in which he confirmed without any emotion that all his fears were in vain, that the deity was indeed real, and that this whole situation was not subject to further discussion. Then the priest, with evident caution in his voice, told him that the god who had come was absolutely real, and that any attempt to resist him would end in disaster, because resistance would cost too high a price for anyone to pay. With a mischievous smile, as if he enjoyed the situation, the man turned back to the lady and asked if she had any other complaints or suggestions, as if this whole conversation was just a game in which he already knew the outcome and controlled every single step. Rudis, bowing his head, submissively replied that he had nothing more to add, for everything he could say had already been said, and now he only had to wait for the decision, which, in his opinion, was inevitable, for everything was predetermined. Standing in the conference room, they continued to discuss that the princess would be setting out on a journey tomorrow, and the decision had already been made, but everyone understood that the future of the city she was heading to depended on many factors, including the will of the gods. Finally, the emperor said with a heavy and determined look that he did not care where his daughter went, but that she must understand that she should not count on the help of the imperial family. His words sounded cruel and malicious, clearly showing his indifference. Rudis was stunned and shocked, her eyes filled with wonder and bewilderment as to how her father could not believe in the power of the ancient gods, who, in her opinion, were supposed to be the key to saving her ambitions and destiny, and how he could ignore their power. She stood in front of her father, unsure of how to respond to his disgusted expression and cold refusal to help, feeling a woman's heart clench with indecision, struggling for calm but having no words to say in response. The afternoon slowly descended upon the earth and the sun, as if tired after a long journey, silently hid behind the majestic walls of the Duke's mansion, painting the sky with soft, warm shades of pink and gold, as if foreshadowing something important. Having brought a soft pillow and a fluffy blanket as white as snow, she thought about how cold it would be at night and diligently tried to create comfort, surrounding herself with soft fabrics, as if they could hide her from the cruel reality and give her at least a little peace. He walked slowly down the street, carrying clothes in his hands and lost in his thoughts, doing important things, but still feeling like something important was slipping away, creating a feeling of anxiety, as if the moment had been lost and the decision was difficult. Rudis was completely surprised by the amount of stuff they were going to take with them on this trip, and he looked at the packing in surprise and bewilderment, feeling like he was losing all sense of why they needed so much stuff for such a short trip. The steward, bowing deeply with due respect, announced that all the articles they had gathered were necessary for their comfortable journey, and that all these supplies had been carefully selected with their needs in mind so that nothing could disturb their comfort during the trip. Rudis tried to resist what was happening, saying with slight irritation and insistence that she did not need so many things at all, because she was sure that all this would only add unnecessary problems and complicate her journey without bringing any benefit. But the butler insisted on his own, because the lady was a princess, which meant that her comfort and well-being should always come first, and all these numerous preparations were only evidence of a deep concern for her high position. The beauty, bowing her head slightly and thinking sadly about what was happening, could not understand why everyone was trying so hard for her, because she knew that it was for her that the Duke's heir was undertaking this dangerous and unpredictable journey. The servant, watching her confusion intently, explained that everyone was deeply grateful to her, because she was willing to fight against the greedy and vile rich, fighting for what she considered right, and she was willing to defend the weak and oppressed, despite the risks. They believed that everything could be bought with money, that wealth and power could solve any problem, but Rudis knew that true value lay in determination and courage, which could not be measured with coins or wealth. The common debt to the people, which the rich never fulfilled, fell on the shoulders of the neighboring duchy, which was the only one that continued to support the common people, trying to somehow correct the injustice and ensure their well-being in these difficult times. Embarrassed, trying to hide her emotion, the noblewoman said that she had always been willing to support the Duke and all his efforts, and even in the most difficult situations, she had never doubted his righteousness and wisdom, willing to accompany him to the end. The butler smiled sweetly at his interlocutor and, bowing his head slightly, added that that was all he wanted to say to her, for he understood that words sometimes could not express all the care and respect he felt for her as a princess. Night fell, and Rudis, feeling the need for peace and quiet, went out onto the mansion's balcony to enjoy the fresh air, breathing in the scent of the night's cool and thinking about what the next day would bring him on that dangerous but exciting journey. The Yankee patio was wrapped in a warm and cozy blanket that could not completely protect her from the cold, and despite this, steam still came out of her mouth, slowly dissolving into the night air like her thoughts dragged into the void. However, she was suddenly interrupted by a loud voice from behind, who asked with curiosity and slight surprise if the aristocrat had woken up and why she had decided to go outside on such a late and freezing night when everyone else had already long since rested. It was Levane who, coming up, turned to the lady with interest and asked her if she had prepared a horse in advance for the upcoming journey, because the trip promised to be long and tiring, and a moment like this tolerated no delays. The gentle Rudis, with a slight sigh, calmly explained that she had conveyed to the nobleman the request that the god wished to ride a horse, and to avoid unnecessary expenses, they had found him a good steed that could easily handle the difficult journey. This satisfied the boy, because lately he really wanted to feel like a real person, to be free from his responsibilities and burdens, and this opportunity gave him confidence, filling his soul with unusual relief. However, this situation left the beauty perplexed, as she could not understand why the ancient deity had suddenly decided to feel weak and mortal, as his powerful might had always been undeniable, and it was strange that he was now struggling from vulnerability. At that moment, she remembered her father's words, which he had spoken with firm determination. He was not going to provide them with financial help, and that irritated her, because she knew how difficult it would be for them without her support in such a difficult situation. Levane noticed her wariness and, unable to resist, asked what was wrong, for he immediately sensed that something was troubling the lady, but he could not understand what exactly was hiding behind her expression and what was causing such anxious concern in her heart. The beautiful lady admitted that she was worried about what they would do when they reached the city, because the situation there was extremely difficult. The infection was at a high level, and this only increased her fears that they might get into a dangerous situation. Suddenly, quite unexpectedly, the sweet young man began to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand, and his laughter sounded a little out of place in the context of such a serious conversation, which only increased the bewilderment of the lady, who did not understand why he was reacting in that way to her concerns. He turned his gaze to his companion and, still smiling, stated that she would soon find out everything that would happen in the future, and that she should not worry so much, because all the questions and concerns would resolve themselves as soon as they were in place. Rudis looked at the young man in confusion, her eyes filled with complete bewilderment as she couldn't understand what he was talking about, and her thoughts were jumbled as she tried to understand the meaning of his words, which seemed strange and had no clear connection to her current situation. The long-awaited day of the journey arrived, and the beauty was sitting in the carriage, dressed in a new dress. Her hair was tied up in a neat ponytail, and in her heart there were mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety, because ahead was a long and difficult journey, full of unknown difficulties. The Duke's heir looked confidently out of the carriage window and announced that they would soon arrive at their destination, not forgetting to add that he himself was continuing his journey on horseback, feeling the freedom and lightness that accompanied him on this journey. Upon hearing his words, the lady calmly replied that everything was fine, but her look became more serious, because she knew that they would soon have to get out of the carriage, and her mind was already preparing for what would come when they arrived. There, in the distance, flashes of red magic could be seen, as if chaos itself was wreaking havoc in the heart of the city, scarlet tongues of fire burning across the mountainous landscapes, creating an atmosphere of horror that quickly spread to the skies, suddenly filling the air with anxiety. The noblewoman felt sick. Her heart sank with fear at seeing such a nightmare in reality. Her gaze could not look away from the burning sky, and she could not understand what was happening in the city, what was causing this terrifying phenomenon. After apologizing to his companions, Rudis resolutely asked what exactly he meant when he spoke of the final stage, as he could not grasp the full gravity of the situation, although his inner unease grew with each new discovery. It turned out that there were 5 levels of infection in the Empire, each representing its own level of threat, and all of this raised serious questions about how soon they would find themselves in the midst of a catastrophe if they did not take the necessary measures. The young man hesitated a little, not knowing how to properly explain that the 5th stage was not the end of the infection, but only meant the transition to much more terrible and terrifying consequences, and tried to find the words to convey the gravity of the situation. The lady shuddered as she heard that this stage meant the beginning of the ceremonies, which instantly filled her soul with alarm and horror, for she could not imagine what monstrous rites could be associated with such horrors, and her heart beat faster with fear. Levane, who was riding beside her, noticed her confusion and calmly explained that people must feel that their end was approaching, and that was why they had named this last stage of the infection as if it were a sign of definitive death. Rudis, visibly intrigued, asked what they meant by such ceremonies. He could not believe that monsters could have conscious rituals, and with increasing curiosity, added that in his opinion, they could not have the intelligence to carry out such actions. Levane was unhappy that the aristocracy preferred to remain silent about such important and terrible aspects as the monster ceremonies, because they were not only terrifying, but also fundamental to their understanding of the situation and survival in this dangerous world. The Duke's heir, not knowing how to answer such an important question, continued riding in silence, with his gaze focused and without the slightest sign of emotion reflected on his face. He seemed tired of the subject and simply preferred to leave it unanswered. Since the nobleman was not going to give an explanation, the god answered for him, explaining that during such ceremonies, monsters turned people into monsters like themselves, infecting them with their powers and will, leaving behind only pitiful, disfigured creatures. The horror reflected on the beauty's face was filled with genuine fear, as she did not expect to hear something like that. Her mind could not accommodate such a terrible reality, and she felt a shiver of fear run down her spine, making her heart beat faster. The sound of the horse's hooves echoed through the deserted road, fast and rhythmic, giving the impression that they were racing towards the unknown, and the whole world around them was filled with those dark and mysterious forces that they were only just beginning to guess at. While riding his horse, Levane thoughtfully said that when all people became monsters, the empire would fall and its future would become uncertain, because such changes could destroy everything that was once great and invincible, leaving only ruins. They soon decided to take a break, stopping the carriage to spend the night, and a small camp was set up around them. A fire was burning, tents were erected, and the whole atmosphere was filled with a sense of calm, despite the anxiety that remained in their hearts. The beauty remained in the carriage, covered with a soft, fluffy blanket, her body trying to find rest, and she dozed, absorbed in thoughts that gave her no peace, and the silence of the night reigned around. Only the fire crackled silently. The Grand Duke's heir was awake, standing near the fire, his gaze directed towards Rudy's, and he was wearing armor that reflected the fire in its metallic shine, and he seemed to be part of this night, absorbed in thoughts about the future. The man had come to apologize to her for not telling her sooner about the ceremonies held among the monsters, believing it would have been too frightening and unreliable for her peace of mind, though he now felt it necessary to discuss it. Rudy's, understanding their situation, looked away as a sign that he understood, because they had neither the time nor the opportunity to talk about it as they should, and they both knew very well that important things are often left for later. However, despite her calmness, there was something that made her uneasy, and she decided to ask directly if the noble was going to kill the people who had been turned into monsters, because it was a matter of life or death, and she could no longer hide her worries. Seraphis froze, his face turning serious, and after a few moments, he remembered the words of the Lord God, who had previously spoken about people who had been turned into monsters, emphasizing that they had lost their human essence, but were still an important element of this destroyed reality. Levane replied that there was no known way to keep people away from monsters, so there was no choice but to destroy them, which sounded cruel, but unfortunately, that was the reality and could not be ignored. The girl clutched her gloves in her hands, her fingers shaking from the horror that gripped her mind, making her think of how hopeless the situation was, and she felt her heart clench with hopelessness and pain, unable to accept those cruel truths. Tears streamed down her face, and she began to realize that she could try to help those who were still alive, but they, already monsters, were not the people she wanted to save, and this thought shook her soul greatly. She was pulled out of those terrible thoughts by the voice of the aristocrat Seraphis, who called her insistently, knowing how hard it was for her to accept such a thought, and although the words were painful, he tried to support her, to give her strength to not lose herself in that moment of despair. Placing his hand on the lady's palm, he promised her that he would be there for her no matter what came, and that she should not worry, because she did not have to bear the full weight of responsibility when there was someone nearby who was willing to help. Rudy's blushed at these words because no one had ever supported her like this before, and that simple yet warm care awakened feelings in her heart that she had not experienced for a long time. Support and hope became her best friends at that moment. The young man concluded his speech by asking the noblewoman to rest at least a little, as tomorrow they had a hard day ahead of them, and she had to be prepared for the tests that awaited her, because, despite her fatigue, there was still a lot ahead of her. The man stepped forward, his iron boots clattering softly on the road, breaking the silence of the night, and headed towards the camp to continue his preparations. But there was peace in his heart, knowing that he had done everything to support her. Seraphis walked forward, lost in thought, his gaze lost in the void as if trying to find answers in the misty abyss of the night. Each step was slow and careful, and the air around him seemed cold and heavy. His green eyes, filled with deep thought, cautiously observed the scene before him, and his brows were furrowed as if he was trying to decipher some hidden meaning in that dark, impenetrable void. There was an impenetrable darkness on all sides, enveloping everything, hiding every detail from the eyes. But almost imperceptibly, the first light of dawn began to break through, softly illuminating the black trees and giving them a mysterious and menacing expression. Rudis, tired from a sleepless night, continued to struggle with himself, trying not to give in to the temptation to close his eyes and sleep, realizing that the night would be difficult and, perhaps, decisive for what awaited them in the dark depths of this world. Without a second thought, she stepped out of the carriage, and as soon as she stepped onto the ground, she felt the cold penetrate her body, causing her instant anxiety. And the cold air was so strong that she involuntarily shivered, trying to warm herself up, but nothing could help her. Suddenly, unexpectedly for her, a pair of male hands appeared from behind her, and she felt a warm cloak fall gently and carefully over her shoulders, which was an incredible relief, as if all the cold had disappeared, giving way to the comfort and security that he brought with his gesture. It was Levane who could not help but notice that the Duke's heir had come to the lady at such a late hour, and despite his calm demeanor, anxiety and jealousy grew in his soul, and he was dissatisfied with what was happening, because such nocturnal visits were not part of his usual perception. The two of them were near the fire, which burned with a dim light, illuminating their figures in this almost complete darkness, and their conversation sounded quiet, and the words seemed almost imperceptible. But despite the silence, they both felt that something was inevitably approaching. The man deliberately moved closer to his interlocutor so that his words could be heard, and his gaze became more attentive, as if each of his words had been carefully weighed and deliberately brought closer to her so that she would definitely hear them. And then Levane, with an expression of genuine interest on his face, asked her if she really liked those tender words and those good actions, as if he wanted to make sure that his efforts were not in vain and that she appreciated his attention. The beauty, shocked by his words, froze in place. Unable to immediately come up with a response, her eyes widened in shock and her mouth dropped open in surprise. She couldn't believe such frank words, and all she could do was remain silent in complete stunned silence, not knowing what to say. Hearing that people love to hear kind words addressed to them, Levane did not resist, although he did not know it before, since he was a god and did not give importance to such trifles. For him it was nothing more than a game, and despite all his arrogance, he accepted. After which the man reminded her that she needed him more than that pompous air of the Duke, and his words sounded self-important, as if he was the one who could give her more than what she apparently preferred. The conversation was suddenly interrupted, for it was time to continue on his way, and Levane, without paying attention to her, advanced quickly, leaving the lady behind, not considering it necessary to wait for her, as if her presence had no importance for his next steps. The sound of the wheels on the road, drowning out all thoughts and conversations, sounded soothing as the carriage moved slowly along the winding road, its wheels squeaking, and each new turn seemed to take them away from that moment, leaving behind shadows of past events. Seraphis stopped the transport, his gaze determined as he announced that they could no longer continue their journey on wheels, and that they would have to go on foot, his words leaving no room for doubt, as if it were inevitable and the only correct decision. He helped the young beauty out of the luxurious carriage, stepping down to the ground next to her, and they both found themselves among the pairs of people passing by, oblivious to their presence, but their footsteps echoed in the void. Rudis felt a strange sense of unease wash over her, as if an elusive aura of oppression was floating around her, and she could sense chaos, hatred, and dark magic filling the air, creating a sense of an ominous presence. What appeared before them was the ancient city, shrouded in the infection stage, its 5th level, where the sky was red, as if covered in blood, and everything around looked like hell on earth, where monsters lived, hidden in the darkness, ready to attack at any moment. The nobleman ordered his subjects to wait for the red flare, and if anything went wrong, they were to leave immediately and inform the emperor. His voice was full of confidence, as if he already knew that the situation could get out of control. Lavane said that it would actually have been wiser for the man to remain outside, as he did not know what might await them inside and did not want to risk the safety of someone who might, in fact, be superfluous on this dangerous mission, having no experience in such matters. But the young man was stubborn and firmly declared that he was going to go with them. Despite all the warnings, his determination was ironclad, and nothing could change his intention to go all the way, even if it meant exposing himself to danger. Lavane finally agreed to take him, and, seeing that everyone was ready, he declared with determination that the time had come to move forward, without allowing himself to waste a single second in doubt, because an unknown and dangerous path awaited them. All around was a scene of destruction and chaos. Houses lay in endless ruins, mud and blood were spilled everywhere, and the very atmosphere emanated a terrible tyranny of fate that swallowed up everything in its path, leaving no trace of life. On the ground, among the ruins, skeletons and skulls lay mercilessly. Their terrible eyes seemed to continue searching for salvation, and each step they took led to new victims, giving this place a feeling of the end of the world. The noblewoman, seeing this nightmare, could not contain a nervous laugh, trying to somehow calm her own fear, but soon, feeling the gravity of the situation, she shrank and, without realizing it, approached the noblewoman, seeking protection and peace in him. They continued walking forward, and Lavane said quietly that there was still hope of finding someone alive, because the sky had not yet turned completely scarlet, and this was a small but important sign that not all was lost. The noblewoman trembled in horror, unable to comprehend that everything around her was so terrible. Her mind could not get used to this destroyed reality, which seemed beyond all logic and human perception. The future duke, noticing her inner unrest, tried to console the lady, assuring her that she should not blame herself for what was happening, because this catastrophe, full of destruction, pain, and irreparable losses, was not her fault, and there was no one who could stop this nightmare. Turning around, he asked where the monsters were headed, his voice full of anxiety, and sensing the gravity of the situation, he added that they should hurry to try to save those who were still alive, because every minute was worth its weight in gold. Seraphis sighed, his face darkening for a moment. He could barely contain his irritation, but despite everything, he firmly promised that they would guide them through those lands as quickly as possible, no matter the difficulties, because time was worth its weight in gold, and there was no room for delay. Lavane, watching the young couple out of the corner of his eye, felt a strange pang of jealousy. His gaze was sharp but hidden, full of discontent, as he was jealous of his lover for that young man. But he remained silent, knowing that his feelings could not interfere in that dangerous mission. The sky above them continued to burn scarlet, like blood, and the clouds, like dark spots, spread across the horizon, obscuring the light, creating an alarming atmosphere where it was difficult to understand what awaited them ahead in that merciless and dying world. The lady walked forward at a fast pace, trying not to slow down, but the Duke followed her, constantly shouting at her to slow down immediately, because the pace was too fast and they needed to be more careful in this dangerous situation. At that moment, Lavane, sensing her tension and anxiety, embraced the princess, asking her if she was okay, inquiring about her condition, as if he cared about her emotional state, because he knew how hard it was to bear all those horrors. Seraphis did not hesitate either, and, after carefully examining the princess, asked about her condition, noting that her face was unusually pale, indicating her internal shock and, possibly, physical exhaustion. Since Lavane was not human, he found it much easier to cope with these harsh conditions. He was hardened by years of existing without knowing weakness or fear, which gave him strength and confidence in the most difficult situations. As for the aristocrat himself, he was also hardened by war and many battles on the battlefield, and therefore did not fear any danger, knowing that in a world full of destruction, it was not the first time that he faced dangers and survived in the harshest conditions. Compared to them, Rudy's felt weak, insignificant, and pathetic. Her body and spirit were empty, and her thoughts were filled with hopelessness, for her strength and determination paled in comparison to those who walked beside her, unwavering in their steadfastness. At that moment the Duke, noticing her tiredness and exhaustion, took the lady in his arms without thinking of the difficulties, because for him there was no obstacle to helping her, and with determination he continued on his way, despite all the dangers that threatened them. Finally, they reached the place where the monsters gathered. Before them stood an ancient fortress, shrouded in bloody darkness and malice, the walls of which seemed to embody the very essence of horror, surrounding everything within a radius of hundreds of meters with darkness and an ominous atmosphere. The gates of the fortress were covered in thick traces of blood, and a symbol was engraved on them, imbued with black magic, emitting a dark aura, as if these gates were a spell that led to the inevitable suffering and destruction of everything in its path. Seraphis sat by the door and thought for a moment, not hiding his determination as he stated that in order to enter, they would have to forcefully break down these ancient doors, as other methods seemed to be ineffective against such a powerful barrier. Levane, however, stepped forward and confidently said that there was no point in breaking anything, because there was another, less destructive way to enter, and he was sure that this way they could enter without the risk of destroying the magical barriers. The man said in a low voice that as soon as Rudy saw the terrifying monsters, she should give the order immediately, and he would decide everything for her without delaying a second, because he was ready to carry out any order without thinking about the consequences. The boy could only act under her orders, because his presence here was the result of a ritual in which she was a victim, and obeying the will of the one who summoned him, he was subject to strict rules that forced him to help her, without having the right to refuse. The girl hesitated, not knowing what order to give to not only demonstrate her strength, but also feel in control of the situation, because her internal conflict was eroding her confidence, forcing her to hesitate when making an important decision. The gates of the great fortress were closed, but through its thick doors ominous sounds could be heard. Darkness, screams, and growls of monsters that seemed to have been ready for some time to unleash their fury, filling the air with a terrible omen of trouble. Rudy spoke loudly, calling upon the god to open the door so they could pass, his words echoing like a magical call in the silence of the night, filling the air with tension, like a call to ancient powers ready to respond. With the help of magic, the doors began to open slowly and mysteriously, as if obeying ancient laws, and a path opened before them, as if fate itself favored their decision, forcing the young people to stop for a moment at the entrance, ready to take a step into the unknown. The Duke turned around in amazement at what was happening and said in surprise that the doors were open, and now nothing prevented them from entering, and a strange feeling of uncertainty invaded him, as if reality itself was beginning to change. Levane, without a moment's hesitation, moved forward with confidence and determination, heading into the dark depths of the fortress, and behind him, not far behind, walked the beauty, her gaze fixed and her heart beating wildly in her chest, anticipating all the trials they would have to endure in that sinister place. There was real chaos everywhere. Destruction and disorder invaded everything in their path, and people, without stopping and without paying attention to the inevitable dangers, continued their exhausting journey along the destroyed road, desperately trying to survive in this darkness. A drop of crimson blood, like a moment in slow motion, slowly fell on her hair, and she involuntarily grimaced, feeling the unpleasant touch that this stain caused, because blood always brought with it associations with something dark and sinister. The boy, realizing the danger of the situation, stood in front of the lady, covering her with himself, and in a determined and calm tone, told her not to look at the terrifying nightmare unfolding around her, and to immediately go upstairs, where there could be at least some protection. He wasted no time in explaining to her exactly why it was worth going up, knowing that every moment could be decisive for her survival, and instead of words, he simply ordered her to hurry so that they would not end up trapped. The rocky walls, covered with a thick layer of mud, reflected the destruction that had enveloped the entire city. Desolation and chaos reigned everywhere, and the city itself, in that terrible cloud of dust, began to look like an unrecognizable ruin, swallowed up by the elements of destruction. There, on the steps in front of the couple, the dark figure of Lavaine suddenly appeared, his long cloak blocking their way, and unhurriedly he addressed Rudis in a decisive and cold tone, ordering him to advance towards him immediately, without losing a minute, because every second counted in a dangerous situation. Stretching his hand forward, the man insistently told her to come to him right now, without delay, understanding that time was not only money, but also life, and that delay could cost them everything they had left in this world full of threats. The noblewoman, trembling with fear and feeling hopeless, could not hold back her tears, her heart breaking with pain and despair, for everything she once knew seemed to be crumbling before her eyes, and there was no hope in sight. Without thinking twice, she, as a last chance, reached out her hand, accepted the help, and squeezed the young man's palm, feeling in his strong grip not only physical support, but also some spark of hope that could help her survive that terrible moment. Immediately, Lavaine, without wasting a second, drew the lady towards him, pressed her against his chest, as if he wanted to protect her from everything that was happening around her, wrapping her in his dark cloak, hiding her from the merciless glances and inevitable dangers of this ruined world. The man, noticing the woman's anxiety, gently but firmly ordered her not to worry, assuring her that she would soon understand everything, and that the most important thing now was not to panic, but to follow him so that they could get out of this deadly situation. Rudis, looking at his companion in surprise, did not know what to answer, but despite his inner doubts, he decided not to object, because at that moment it was difficult for him to orient himself, and his confidence inspired him with at least a small but hope. Once they reached the top, they found themselves in a room whose walls were covered in drawings that were an inexorable reminder of the destruction. Dirt, blood, dark traces of magic left by vanished forces gave this place a creepy and sinister appearance. The Duke's heir walked beside the lady, holding a sword in his hand, ready to protect her at any time, as if he knew that in this world danger lurked around every corner, and he was ready to face her head-on to ensure her safety. Slowly, carefully, the beauty extended her fragile hand and opened the door, and immediately a bright light spilled into the room, illuminating the space, as if inviting them to an unknown world where every movement could be decisive. When they reached the roof, their eyes met a terrible sight. A huge, sinister seal was depicted on the floor, and the souls of the dead flew across the sky, ghosts whose screams tore through the silence, filling the air with fear and horror. A variety of impressive monsters were tirelessly spinning around, their shadows flickering in the dim light, and an ominous whisper floating in the air, as if they were talking to each other, ready to attack at any moment. Some of them were sitting on the roof sills. The demons, their mouths agape and their evil eyes flaming, whispered among themselves, their whispers filling the air like a curse, and the scarlet sky, like a bloody shroud, hung low, creating an atmosphere of evil menace that grew thicker by the moment. The young noblewoman could not bear it any longer, and burst into tears when one of the monsters noticed them, and her heart trembled with fear, because at that moment it seemed to her that the end was near, and that everything they had experienced until now did not matter in the face of this terrible fate. The monsters immediately began to attack them, and the future Duke, without a thought for himself, stood forward with a sword, ready to fight to the end, not intending to retreat and protect her at any cost, even if it meant facing inevitable death. A huge claw, like a shadow of horror, stretched out towards the beauty, and she froze in fear, unable to move, her mind seized by horror and her body seemed to be paralyzed, not giving in to the slightest movement. The lady, unable to bear the tension and fear for her life, screamed, begging Lavaine to protect them and find a way to turn those monsters back into people, relying on his strength and determination, because she saw no other way out of this terrifying nightmare. When the blow did not follow and the beautiful girl remained alive, she opened her eyes in surprise, determined to find out what had happened, because in her mind there was only one thing. She should have died already, but this world continued to exist around her. There, ahead, was Lavaine, and around him were many ordinary citizens who, as if by magic, had returned to their human form. All were alive and well, and the scarlet sky, which had been so ominous before, gradually turned blue, clearing itself of dark omens. The people, looking at each other in surprise, discovered with joy that he had returned to his former human form, and their hearts were filled with happiness and joy at once becoming what they were before this terrible transformation. The noble woman was in complete shock at what had just happened, and her mind, trying to understand what was happening, had difficulty grasping these events until the god explained to her that all this was the fulfillment of her sincere wish, as if the universe itself had responded to her request. Pressing his hand against her face, Lavaine told her tenderly and lovingly that everything had happened exactly as she had wished, that her wish had been fulfilled, and now, despite everything she had experienced, she could find at least a little peace, because all the fears and horrors that had seemed inevitable were finally behind her. The table in the room was huge, made of stone, and its cold surface added heaviness, while the conversations, the whispers of people coming back to life, created an atmosphere of truce between fear and hope, as if reality itself had taken its place again. This building became their temporary refuge, and the Duke coldly and determinedly gave orders, helping the citizens to calm down a bit, while Rudy's, sitting to the side, absorbed in her thoughts, tried to understand what exactly had happened. She was still in a panic, her body still shaking from what she had experienced, and the sweat that continued to run down her face did not hide the horror that was still alive in her eyes, as if she could not believe that all of this was true, that she had really survived. Her palms, despite her efforts to calm down, still trembled, and a painful weakness did not leave her. Even sitting safely, she felt how bad she felt, as if her soul still could not free itself from the shadow of fear that had remained on her body and mind like an indelible mark. Everything ended well. The brave Lavaine saved everyone and, using his powers, was able to return the monsters to their human forms, giving them a second life and a chance to recover, which was a true miracle, as impossible as it seemed. Rudy's was filled with horror, for he knew perfectly well that what the god would do depended on his will, for his power and ability to control his actions could change everything, and he looked at his hand with alarm, feeling the weight of that burden. Lavaine stood slightly to one side, his black cloak tightly buttoned and his shirt carefully concealing his figure. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, neither interfering in what was happening nor helping the citizens, observing the events with cold imperturbability. Suddenly, Seraphis turned to the princess and told her that the people would very much like to greet her properly and express their gratitude for her help, for saving them, and for giving their world a chance to recover again. The sweet noblewoman, a little confused and surprised, could not understand why it was she and not the duke or the god who was attracting attention, since her status was not so outstanding compared to them, and everything that was happening seemed a little strange to her. The noblewoman, not fully aware of her own beauty, cast a quick glance at her companion, who was standing by the weapon and not taking part in the conversation. His silence only increased the feeling of distance between him and all the other interlocutors. Deciding that it would be beneficial for everyone, the aristocrat agreed and, rising from her seat, walked forward, ready to go with the Duke, realizing that her participation in this gesture was more important than it seemed at first glance and would have long-term consequences. Ordinary citizens were already waiting for them in the hallway. The entire young couple was surrounded by people who loudly thanked the princess for saving her and did not stop expressing their gratitude, joyfully raising their hands and shouting loudly in thanks. Suddenly, a lady in a cloak and a short skirt approached. She was descended from a noble family, and her name was Alcester Bologna, and thanking the princess declared that now her family would be indebted to her, and they would pay this debt. Rudy's protested loudly, asking whether they should not praise the emperor and not this pathetic princess who, in his opinion, was not worthy of attention, since she had nothing remarkable and could not compare with the greatness of the true ruler. Alcester Bologna calmly replied that they all knew how things really were, and for that they were grateful to him, because his struggle and strength were meant to protect the people, and not the cruel and heartless tyrant who had ruled this world for so long. Everyone in the city had turned their backs on them, believing there was no point in saving these monsters, because they were already dead to the world, and the scarlet sky above their heads was a bright, disturbing reminder of the fall of all that once existed, destroyed by merciless cruelty. The lady, realizing her boldness and rudeness, begged forgiveness, but then, bowing her head, with deep respect and sincerity, asked the beauty to accept her oath of fidelity and promise to serve, hoping that her sincere desire to be useful and faithful would be accepted with gratitude. The noblewoman stood in a state of shock, not fully understanding how radically all those people had changed, and how their destinies were now intertwined with hers, because she could not imagine that such fateful moments could change her life and the entire world around her so much. All the villagers began to smile when Rudy's accepted their oath, and happiness filled their hearts, because now they felt that they belonged to something bigger, feeling part of a great cause, willing to dedicate themselves to serving the princess and protecting her until the end. Now they all became subjects of the princess, swearing to protect her, to become her weapon and sword, to follow her every command without hesitation, without thinking of their own safety, for the sake of fulfilling their duty and loyalty to their oath. The people, diligently gathering the carriage for the aristocrat, prepared for her return journey, while others were busy collecting all the things and supplies necessary for the long and difficult journey that awaited them, because the road was full of trials. At that moment, Rudy sat on a warm blanket by the fire, feeling the cold penetrate his body, but trying to warm himself, he enjoyed a brief moment of peace, thinking about what lay ahead and the trials he would have to overcome. The man's hand reached out for her hair, and upon noticing it, the god realized how tired the lady was. Her face expressed an almost lifeless heaviness, and her eyes, full of tiredness, seemed to have begun to lose their ability to see, and she was almost falling asleep right there. However, as soon as the hand approached, Rudy's pulled her palm away with surprising speed, and a mixture of horror and fear appeared in her eyes, as if she had imagined something terrible that made her feel an invisible threat in the air. Lavaine, realizing that his movement might have frightened the girl, apologized with sincere regret, calmly explaining that he did not mean to scare her and that his intentions were completely innocent, but his surprised face could not go unnoticed. When she finally recognized him as her friend, her face lit up with instant relief, and the sigh she had been holding in for so long burst from her chest, and the fear and tension that had been gripping her instantly disappeared, giving way to peace. The man tilted his head slightly to one side, studying her with indescribable interest, and noticing the expression of fear on her face, asked with slight surprise why she was so afraid of him, because her fear was not obvious to him and even strange, as if he could not understand it. Then he added with moderation and coldness that, unfortunately, nothing could be done about it. Such was his nature. He was a god, not a man, and sometimes his actions could be cruel, but that was part of his essence, which could not be changed. Rudy's pressed his hand against his chest, as if trying to contain a storm of emotions, and asked with slight emotion why he continued to obey her. Was it only because she helped him get out of the chaos and enter this world, despite her power? After all, he had promised before that he would always believe her no matter what she said, and her words and actions would always mean the most to him. So why did his loyalty now seem so dubious and unconvincing? The young man always protected her, saved her, hugged her, and comforted her, and it seemed that his heart was not able to contain any other feelings than those that only sincere care and duty provoked. But deep down he could no longer hide the true experiences that were beginning to pull him in another direction. However, at some point, Lavaine admitted that he really did have feelings for her, and his help was not just a matter of duty, but was dictated by inner emotions that he did not want to admit. However, after a moment of silence, he finally added that he could not reveal to her the real reason why he always obeyed her words without question, because this reason was so deeply personal and hidden that he did not feel ready to open up and explain it. The fire burned brightly, its flames rose into the night sky, illuminating everything around, creating a magical atmosphere, and the crackling firewood, as if alive, danced in the fiery whirlwind, forming a fascinating picture which seemed to contain the very essence of fire magic. The beautiful lady, with evident interest, asked if she could use her extraordinary power to restore at least part of the destroyed city, believing that her abilities could help her face this difficult and important task. The man explained that although it was extremely difficult and required great effort, he could still try to fulfill his request because his strength allowed him to do so, although he would have to face many difficulties. And then he added that if such a kind lady made such great demands of him, he must pay her a corresponding price to deserve her help in such an important and difficult matter, since her efforts and time could not be wasted. The noblewoman shuddered at these words, and feeling the determination rising within her, her eyes flashed like fire, and with fury in her voice she screamed that she would never sacrifice herself, no matter what demands or expectations were made of her. The man covered his face with his hand, as if hiding a smile, and softly explained that the sacrifice was not at all necessary. He only wanted something more from her, something much simpler, something that did not require so many painful sacrifices and privations on his part. Rudis waited patiently for him to continue, trying to figure out what exactly the man wanted in return for his help, but he suddenly stopped and, with a slight hint of doubt in his voice, said that he was not yet ready to reveal his intentions. Then Levain, with a careful and gentle movement, covered her with the blanket, which slipped slightly from her shoulders, and, looking at her thoughtfully, told her that all that was really important would be revealed later, when the time came when she was ready to hear the revelations. After this, the nobleman gently asked the beautiful lady to rest and regain her strength, and he himself, silently and imperceptibly, left the room, leaving her alone so that she could be alone with her own thoughts, immersed in the silence of the night, full of reflection and anticipation. The lady, sitting on a log near a bright fire, gazed in wonder at the endless sky, dotted with stars that shone beautifully around the majestic fortress tower, creating a feeling of complete peace and comfort in the silence of the night. Soon they continued on their way. The horse-drawn carriage rolled along the winding road, and the ground beneath the hooves responded reasonably with its dull thud, filling everything around with a quiet, rhythmic sound, as if nature itself were observing their movement. When they arrived at the place, they were already eagerly awaited. The doors of the fortress were wide open, and the transport advanced inside without any obstacles, giving the impression that everything was prepared for their arrival, and they arrived just in time. The servants, welcoming their masters with warm and friendly smiles, greeted them joyfully, assuring them that everything had been carefully prepared for their comfortable stay, and looked forward to the time when they would be able to fulfill all their requests, ready to satisfy their needs. Rudis and the future Duke were sitting quietly in the room, lost in their thoughts, when suddenly a guest walked through the door and immediately attracted their attention with his unexpected visit, breaking the silence and creating a feeling of something important and disturbing in the air. It was the butler, who stood in the doorway, visibly worried, and apologized to his masters for his interference and for having arrived without waiting with the news immediately after their long and tiring journey, interrupting their rest. The nobles, hearing these words and seeing the expression on the servant's face, shuddered at the same time, feeling a growing anxiety take hold of them because they understood that the servant brought important news, hoping that the news would be less unpleasant than they could imagine. Many luxurious gifts were sent, including boxes of precious jewels and rare valuables, each of which was a clear testimony of the respect and admiration directed towards the charming Rudis. Dear Rudis was in complete shock. She couldn't believe that all those magnificent things were actually given to her, because she couldn't understand how so many people at the same time could show her such incredible generosity and attention. The maid explained that for the first 5 days after the princess left, people perceived her as a fraud and did not trust her, which surely had an impact on how she was received in her new environment, where there was distrust and caution towards her. But soon after the momentous event occurred, the guards came to the emperor with important news that brought about significant changes in the princess's position, as well as an improvement in her reputation in the eyes of the rulers and their inner circle. The ruler of the empire, turning around in confusion, asked the guard what he wanted from him, as his thoughts were busy with what was happening in the capital, and it was difficult for him to concentrate on one thing at that moment, when everything around him seemed so unusual. The man, looking at the clear blue sky, realized that the city had been freed from the monsters, and although he found it hard to believe what was happening, he still began to understand that such a thing was only possible in the most incredible situations that had previously seemed fantastic to him. A few minutes passed, and stammering a little, he said that from now on all the attention of the capital would be focused on Rudy's, who, despite his role, was increasingly becoming a symbol of the city's salvation, a savior whose name would be written into history. The future hero noticed how the attitude of the nobles towards the princess was rapidly changing, whom they had previously despised and considered unworthy. But now that the situation had changed, their views began to transform towards respect and even admiration. Looking at the lady beside him, the man added that Earl Abbot had probably offered her a helping hand, and that his attitude toward her had become considerably friendlier, which was a notable and important step in how he began to perceive her and her place among others. Rudis looked away from the man's gaze because he wasn't thinking about the nobles. A lot had happened in the past few days, and his thoughts were occupied with completely different matters that required much more of his attention and concentration. Looking up with determination, the lady realized that she could no longer sit idly by and decided that it was time to leave the old place and move to a new house right now, without delay, because the moment of change in her life had arrived and she could not miss it. The dress was white, with a beautiful hem, decorated with barely noticeable lace, which gave the image an incredible lightness and elegance, perfectly reflecting her new status, which was now obvious to everyone around her, as if emphasizing her changes. The main servant of the imperial palace, bowing slightly, approached the rest of the servants, greeting before them the princess, who seemed to become an increasingly important figure for the life of the palace and all its inhabitants with each passing day. The man was old, his wrinkles betraying many years of work, his half-closed eyes hiding his disinterest, and his gray hair and tense expression indicated that he was extremely unfriendly and unwilling to show warm feelings. Rudis looked intently at the man, who had not previously participated in her beating, but also did not stop those who approached her, as if he did not want to interfere, and remained as a spectator, which caused her mixed feelings. The servant, responding coldly and reservedly, reported that the emperor was already waiting for her in his chambers, leaving no room for questions or confusion, emphasizing that the visit was expected and should take place immediately, without delays on the female part. The lady shuddered, feeling a slight uneasiness, and immediately noticed that usually only his favorites were allowed into the ruler's chambers, which became a reason for her caution, because such a visit could mean something more than mere courtesy. The steward insisted that the emperor himself had allowed and personally called his daughter to his chambers, which sounded strange, but he nevertheless assured that the order came from the ruler himself and her presence there was absolutely necessary. When they finally reached their destination, the servant, out of old habit, announced the lady's arrival at the palace, and then, having fulfilled his duty, quietly withdrew, leaving the father and daughter alone, where their meeting could undoubtedly become an important moment for both parties. Bartold stood in the room with his back to the lady, and she, waiting patiently for her father, the emperor, to begin the conversation, felt each moment stretching out into infinity, and her nerves, despite all their apparent moderation, began to give way to excitement, aggravated by the long wait. The emperor, noticing that the lady had finally arrived at his side, irritably declared that he had been waiting for her arrival for a long time, and that he should have appeared earlier, since together with her he was also awaiting the arrival of the young knight, with whom he had to discuss important matters. The conversation revolved around a man named Levain, who at that moment was resting on the sofa in no hurry to get up and show activity, thereby adding even more irritation to the atmosphere, since his presence could be related to something serious. The ruler, determined to once again play the role of a caring father, said tensely and insincerely that he was glad the lady had returned home safely, although his words were only a formality, hiding deep discontent and hidden anger at what was happening. After which the man, trying to look interested, asked if it was difficult for her and how she managed to deal with the monsters so easily, as if he himself could not believe that all this happened so simply and without any extra effort on the part of the woman. The man was filled with excitement, greed, and a lust for power when he learned that his daughter actually possessed the kind of power that could be the key to his ambitions, and he realized that her powers could prove invaluable to his own plans. A mocking smile appeared on the ruler's face as he shared with some satisfaction the news he had recently learned about the high priest and his connection to the sacrifice, as well as the connection to the summoned god, which seemed to leave no room for doubt as to his intentions. Rudy's, intrigued but still confused, listened to him, not understanding why he was bringing up such an old topic that seemed to have been forgotten long ago, and why it had suddenly come up again in the conversation if it had no particular significance for the current situation. Then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the man forcefully pushed his daughter against the wall, his hands gripping her shoulders harshly, and she couldn't help but react, grimacing in surprise and shock, feeling the full weight of his strength and determination, which made her heart beat double speed. The ruler, looking at his daughter sadly and emotionlessly, suggested that Selena could become a victim instead. His words were full of cold calculation, and his gaze, devoid of any regret, demonstrated a complete lack of moral hesitation about such an idea. The noblewoman stood frozen in complete shock, unable to believe her ears, her mind unable to immediately comprehend such words, and she felt her blood slowly run cold in her veins, and her heart sank from shock and complete disbelief at what was happening before her eyes. At this moment, the god sitting on the sofa couldn't help but laugh, shocked by the stupidity of the ruler of the empire, whose actions and decisions were so naive and lacking in all wisdom that even this supernatural being couldn't help but mock. The man began to laugh out loud. His laughter, full of bewilderment, echoed throughout the room, and the father and daughter, unable to understand the reason for such laughter, simultaneously turned towards him, wondering what could have made the young man so happy in such a tense and serious situation. The boy, still laughing, explained with surprise that it was the first time he had heard such an absurd proposal from a person to sacrifice his second daughter, uttered without any logic, as if it were not an important decision, but rather a matter on which the fate of an entire life depended. But soon the young man's face became serious and impassive, and Lavaine, with a terrible look, declared that the man was a short-sighted fool since he could not distinguish where the sky began and where the earth ended, not realizing the consequences that awaited him for such a naive decision. The ruler began to tremble with fear. His hands trembled slightly and the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. The man looked anxiously at his interlocutor, trying to find the right phrases, but deep down he felt that he might say something wrong, which would further aggravate his situation. The god was silent, his gaze intent, and a slow, silent process was taking place within him, as if he were trying to understand whether the emperor understood the true meaning of the terrible word, sacrifice, and what consequences it could have for all those associated with this concept. When the young man explained that the victim died quickly, giving up her blood and flesh, the ruler shuddered, his face twisted in confusion, and he pointed at Rudy's, trying to understand why she survived, but Selena, in his opinion, could not survive. The boy, holding back his emotions, replied that Rudy's was unique, different from everyone else, and that her survival was a consequence of the enormous price she paid, unlike others, and it was this price that gave her the opportunity to continue living. For the young noblewoman, these words were a true revelation, for the girl could not remember what price she had already paid to herself and to God, and this left her plunged into deep thought, creating a feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. Lavaine sat in his chair, his body tense with fatigue, but his face remained calm and focused, as if he were ready to face any turn of events, remaining unfazed despite all the storm of emotions raging around him. At that moment, loud screams were heard in the second princess's chambers, echoing throughout the room. She was sitting up in bed, and the ladies and servants were bustling around her, trying to calm her down, but the anxiety and chaos only increased with each passing minute. Selena was extremely unhappy that her father allowed this scoundrel named Rudy's into his chambers, especially since he had mudblood, which she considered insufficient for those who dared to be in her company. Ivana, sitting by the huge bed, said with a firm voice that she personally saw her sister, the princess, enter her father's chambers, and her words sounded like irrefutable evidence, fully confirming her version of events. Selena, holding back a furious attack of irritation, gritted her teeth, unable to accept the fact that the emperor would leave everything behind so easily, as if he were going to forget about his beloved daughter, as if her feelings and dignity had no value in his eyes. Suddenly, Ivana smiled and then, as if by chance, remembered that the ruler had previously given the room to his lover's sister, which was a shock to Selena because she could not believe that her father was able to change his loyalty so easily. This revelation was a real blow to the stomach for the lady, because she could not even imagine that her father would so quickly lose all affection for her, choosing instead that stupid Rudy's, whom he considered unworthy of so much attention and love. The glass shattered on the cold floor with a loud metallic sound, and screams filled with despair and pain echoed throughout the room, creating an atmosphere of hopelessness that fell upon everyone present, causing one's heart to tighten with tension. Selena, unable to contain her storm of emotions, began to cry out loud, desperately screaming that she would never give up her hated sister, who was so dear to her father, and that she would do everything in her power to maintain her position. The servants, standing silently behind the princess, carried out her every command with restraint and patience, hiding their feelings and experiences, steadfastly enduring her whims and insecurities, being only mute witnesses to this stormy scene unfolding before them. At that moment, Ivana hid her satisfied smile under her hand, realizing that her cunning plan against the royal family had finally begun to bear fruit, and her manipulations had achieved their goal, destroying everything that seemed unshakable. When the conversation with the emperor was over, Rudy's, overwhelmed by fatigue and depression, left the office and, feeling the weight of what was happening, leaned helplessly against the wall, unable to contain the emotions that were boiling inside her, thinking about how her life was once again in danger. The father threw her out, knowing that his futile plan had no chance of success, lost in thought as to how he could believe that a god would succumb to his manipulation to achieve his ambitious goals if he sacrificed his beloved second daughter. When suddenly the handsome Mr. Levain, holding out his hand to Rudy's, appeared before her with such an expression on his face that she, a little surprised, froze, and for a moment could not understand what was happening. Her heart beat faster with surprise and excitement. The young man, with a slight smile on his lips, explained that, observing other people, he saw how those who value themselves, with warmth and affection, take their loved ones by the arm and walk in that single step, as if they shared all the moments of life, and that is why he wanted to do the same. He added that he did not want to hurt her at all, but on the contrary, he tried to show her tenderness and affection, because in her presence he felt that his heart was filled with warmth and kindness, and he wanted to be as attentive and affectionate as possible with her. Rudy's, looking away and hesitating a little, said in a restrained voice that she was simply deeply disturbed by everything that was happening, but despite this, she did not feel any fear towards him, because in her soul there was much more anxiety and concern than fear of that gesture. From the beginning, she did not put any hope in God, realizing that his powers were immeasurable and far beyond her understanding. But, despite this, she did not turn away from him, feeling how he could influence her destiny at any time, even if she did not want him to. The young man, upon hearing her assure him that she was not upset, could not believe her words, because his eyes immediately noticed that look, full of pain and worry, that she could not hide, despite all her efforts to maintain external calm. The boy, taking a step back and noticing her internal struggle, said with a slight regret in his voice that, despite everything that had happened, he would not blame her or pressure her. He would simply wait for her decisions and be willing to follow her orders, assuring her that he is on her side, despite the circumstances. The lady, ready to respond and express her opinion, had already opened her mouth, but she did not have time to say a word, because at that moment the god suddenly turned into dust, dissolved into the air, and disappeared, leaving her confused, feeling how anxiety chained her thoughts and gave her no peace. A new day had dawned, and in a duchy renowned for its architectural grandeur and extraordinary beauty, the air was heavy with the sense of a new beginning, as if the land itself were preparing for great changes. The beautiful Rudy's stood in front of the palace, a determined expression on her face and her hand firmly placed on her chest, firmly declaring that she was going to Geheim to visit the ancient temple where she sought spiritual peace and tranquility. The man immediately offered his assistance, willing to send his lady to the church if she had any important business there, but the lady politely declined, showing a firm desire to personally visit that sacred place to fulfill her duty herself. Admiring the beauty around her, she quietly said that her visit to the church was related to her friend, God, and that she hoped to receive important information that could open new paths and answers to her questions. The young man's words came to mind, saying that Rudy's had already paid his price, and therefore no longer needed to give his blood and flesh, for his duty was already fulfilled, and further sacrifices would be superfluous and unnecessary.